Chapter 395. That young blacksmith from before had wanted to attract Gongsun Xiaoye's attention. He was in a hurry to get first place, so he was eliminated. Hence, the other blacksmiths did not dare to be careless, and identified them very carefully. Even a talented forging genius like Shintu Yuan had only managed to identify the seventh piece. Hence, Yi Guqin's performance was very outstanding. Shintu Yuan frowned and said, "The path of blacksmithing requires a calm heart. If you are so anxious and impatient, how can you achieve greatness?" Shintu Yuan was the most capable blacksmith among the young blacksmiths here. Hence, when he spoke, many people agreed with him. Yi Guqin frowned slightly. From Shintu Yuan's tone, it sounded like the older generation reprimanding the younger generation. However, it was indeed not too difficult for Yi Guqin to identify these materials. He did not need to spend so much time. These materials that were difficult for ordinary blacksmiths to identify were all recorded in the Heavenly Works mineral collection. As long as he recalled and compared them, he would be able to identify them. Hence, Yi Guqin had maintained such a speed. However, why did it become impatient in Shintu Yuan's eyes? Seeing that Yi Guqin did not listen to him, Shintu Yuan shook his head and said, "Rotten wood cannot be carved. Such advice is useless. You are destined to not go far on the path of blacksmithing. What does my business have to do with you?" Yi Guqin frowned slightly. Even a clay figurine would have some anger. Furthermore, Shintu Yuan did not know Yi Guqin's ability. His casual words were annoying. "Young Master Shintu, please don't mind him. That kid is such a person. Previously, he had escorted us all the way to northern Yang City. He was arrogant and thought that he was great." At this moment, Lady Xiao stood out and sneered with her hands on her hips. Lady Xiao spared no effort to please the people of the Shintu family. "Oh, there's such a thing?" Shintu Yuan was surprised. "That's right. This kid's life is cheap, but his heart is higher than the sky. I kindly introduced him to become a guard of the Shintu family, but he ignored me." Lady Xiao snorted. "No wonder he has such a personality." Shintu Yuan shook his head. Madame Zhao's voice was very loud and almost everyone in the gem forging building heard it. "What? This kid is just a guard. A guard dares to compete with us blacksmiths on the same stage?" Some of the blacksmiths were shocked, and then they felt insulted. They heard from Madame Xiao that Yi Guqin had escorted them all the way, so they immediately treated Yi Guqin as a guard. "Madam, just shut up," Xiao Lai shouted. Even he couldn't bear to watch any longer. Xiao Wanru also sighed. Madame Zhao's words in public undoubtedly put Yi Guqin on the spot. Interesting, very interesting. Behind the curtain, Gongsun Xiaoye also clapped and laughed. The situation was getting more and more interesting. However, Yi Guqin ignored the discussions around him and the strange gazes directed at him. He had already identified the last material. There's actually a precious material like meteorite sand? Yi Guqin was slightly surprised. A precious material like meteorite sand could be used to forge a high-grade mystical weapon. In the Saint Origin dynasty, such a material was almost extinct. Probably not many people would be able to recognize it. However, Yi Guqin recognized it. He directly called the attendant beside him and gave him the answer. This kid has already identified it. So fast. I'm afraid he didn't guess it blindly. I have never seen his last material before. Seeing that Yi Guqin had finished identifying it, there was an uproar again. Just wait to be kicked out. Shintu Yuan snorted coldly. He had already identified the ninth piece. On the other side, the attendant took out a list and compared it. He frowned and then said, 10 pieces of material, all wrong. What? All wrong? Did I hear wrongly? All wrong. This kid is really just a guard. He only did this to attract Miss Gongsuan's attention. When the attendant reported the result, the entire gem forging building was in an uproar. No matter how bad the blacksmiths who had been eliminated were, they could at least identify 4 or 5 ores. However, Yi Guqin was completely wrong. Madame Xiao was grinning from ear to ear and spared no effort in mocking him. The corner of Shintu Yuan's mouth curled into a sneer as he shook his head. This result was within his expectations. However, Yi Guqin, who was under the bamboo hat and veil, frowned slightly. All wrong? How could it be? Maybe something went wrong, Yi Guqin said indifferently. You don't even want to admit your own failure. How sad. I, Shintu Yuan, really don't want to compete with someone like you. Shintu Yuan snorted coldly. The other contestants also jeered and looked down on Yi Guqin. I didn't expect Yi Guqin to be such a person. Xiao Wanru saw everything. She was suddenly very disappointed in Yi Guqin. To think that she still regretted her decision and wondered if she should find the jade slip. Now, it seemed that Madame Zhao's decision was right. What sense of responsibility did a person who was unwilling to accept his own failure and mistakes have? Someone, send the guest out. At this moment, Gongsun Xiaoye's voice came from behind the curtain. There was a hint of anger. Obviously, this little chilly thought that she had been played and was angry. She actually let random people in to compete. TSK, you went for wool and came home shorn. This time, you even angered Miss Gongsun. Serves you right. Many people around rolled their eyes and gloated. I can leave on my own, Yi Guqin said coldly. Although he did not know what misunderstanding there was, since it was already like this, Yi Guqin would not stay here. Although he wanted the snow clay fetus, he could not give up his dignity. And just at this moment, Shintu Yuan's 10 materials had been identified. The attendant in charge of Yi Guqin went forward and took out a list to compare. Suddenly, his face turned pale. Shintu Yuan straightened his back and looked very confident. Obviously, he was very confident. However, the attendant had a strange look and said, Shintu Yuan, all 10 materials are wrong. The smile on Shintu Yuan's face had just spread, but it suddenly froze. Madame Xiao and the rest, who had originally wanted to flatter and cheer, were also extremely shocked. How can it be? How can young Master Shintu identify all the materials incorrectly? There must be a problem. Madame Xiao was the first to stand up and speak out. That's right. How can young Master Shintu be all wrong? Another person echoed. Shintu Yuan's face was also a little gloomy. Even he himself did not believe that he was wrong. Previously, when Yi Guqin identified all the materials incorrectly, no one questioned. They all thought that it was natural. However, when Shintu Yuan identified all the materials incorrectly, everyone thought that there must be some misunderstanding. At this moment, even Gongsun Xiaoyan knew that there must be a problem. At this moment, the attendant who had announced the results took out a list to compare again. His body suddenly trembled, and he said shakily, Everyone, I'm really sorry. I took out the wrong list. No wonder. I see. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Shintu Yuan's expression also relaxed, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Shintu Yuan identified 10 materials, 8 correct, the attendant said loudly. He actually got 8 correct. Shintu Yuan is indeed a forging genius. The surrounding people flattered him. The smile on Shintu Yuan's face also gradually widened. With this result, he should be able to be ranked first. Madame Xiao spared no effort in flattering him, wantonly praising Shintu Yuan's amazing forging talent. However, after that, the attendant's eyes had a trace of suspicion. He opened his mouth again and said in a slightly strange tone, I have mixed up Shintu Yuan's list with that person's. That young man called Qin. The attendant's tone was slightly bitter, and he continued. Identified 10 materials, correct, 10. When this was said, the noisy tower of jewels fell into a dead silence. Chapter 396. In the gem forging building, both the participating blacksmiths and the surrounding spectators could not believe their ears. They couldn't quite believe their ears. As for Shintu Yuan, he reached out and grabbed the servant's collar. His tone was cold as he said, "What did you say? Say it again." "I mixed up your list with young Master Chen's list." That young master identified 10 materials, and all 10 were correct. The attendant's body trembled as he faced Shintu Yuan. But that was the truth, and he could not lie. "Are you sure?" Shintu Yuan's tone had a hint of threat. "This is indeed so." The attendant complained in his heart, but he did not dare to make another mistake. Otherwise, he would definitely be skinned alive by Lady Gongsun. I don't believe it." Shintu Yuan pushed the attendant away fiercely and picked up the list to compare. With one look, his face became even more gloomy. Could it be true? The surrounding spectators saw this and their hearts skipped a beat. As for the participating blacksmiths, none of them were willing to believe it. They didn't believe that a kid who was born as a guard would be able to surpass them in judging talents. Even the forging genius Shintu Yuan was not as good as him. At this moment, Yi Guqin had almost stepped out of the gem forging building's door. It was at this crucial moment that the curtain on the second floor of the building was suddenly lifted. A red, exquisite figure flew down like a swallow and chased to the entrance of the gem forging building. Lady Gongsun has appeared. There was an uproar in the gem forging building. Yi Guqin was about to step out of the door when a red figure landed in front of him and blocked his path. The person who appeared in front of Yi Guqin was a 15 or 16-year-old girl in red makeup. The girl was petite, with starry eyes, a fine nose, and an almond-shaped face. Her jet-black hair was tied into 2 pigtails. Coupled with the curve of her mouth, she was obviously a pampered and unruly person. From head to toe, if there was a flaw, it would be the flat expanse of land in front of her chest. "Hey, you're called Chen, right? You're not allowed to leave." The girl in red said directly with her hands on her waist. Chen was Yi Guqin's pseudonym when he registered. He recognized at a glance that the young lady in front of him was the pearl of the Gongsun family, Gongsun Xiaoye, who was rumored to be married to Shintu Miao. It was just that Yi Guqin found it hard to imagine the contrast between Shintu Miao's muscular and boorish figure and Gongsun Xiaoye's petite figure. "I think you were the one who said to send the guests off." Yi Guqin's tone was still indifferent. That's because that idiot misread the list and misled me. Since you can identify all 10 materials, you should have some skill." Gongsun Xiaoye's beautiful eyes revealed excitement, as if she had met a rare opponent. Seeing Gongsun Xiaoye pestering him, Yi Guqin pondered for a moment and said, "If you want me to stay, I can. But after I defeat you, I want enough snow clay embryos." Gongsun Xiaoye patted her flat chest and said, The competition hasn't even started and you're already saying that you can defeat me. I'm really interested in this guy who hides his head but only shows his tail. Although snow clay embryos are precious, my Gongsun family has a lot of them. I promise you." Yi Guqin nodded slightly and returned to the Tower of Jewels with Gongsun Xiaoye. Inside the tower, when everyone saw Gongsun Xiaoye and Yi Guqin return together, their eyes were filled with shock. This person was actually invited back by Miss Gongsun personally. He really has a lot of face. I don't believe that he can really identify all 10 materials. There were still some blacksmiths who had doubts. They couldn't accept that this guy who wore a bamboo hat and didn't even dare to show his face could beat them in blacksmithing. "Miss Gongsun, could this be a mistake? Although this guy's cultivation is not bad, he doesn't have any talent in blacksmithing." At this moment, Madame Xiao stepped forward. She didn't want to see Yi Guqin receiving special treatment from Gongsun Xiaoye. One had to know that Gongsun Xiaoye was Shintu Miao's official wife. "You mean that I made a mistake in my judgment?" Gongsun Xiaoye looked at Madame Xiao with a hint of playfulness in her tone. Perhaps there was a mistake," Madame Xiao said thoughtfully. In the next moment, Gongsun Xiaoye's figure suddenly turned into a red shadow and swept in front of Madame Xiao, slapping her. Poor Madame Xiao. She had just been slapped by the Shintu family's guard and had yet to recover. Now, She was slapped again by Gongsun Xiaoye. Her cheek swelled even higher, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. Mother! Xiao Wanru held Madame Xiao and bit her jade lips tightly. Their family had no status in front of Gongsun Xiaoye at all. How dare an old woman like you question my matters? Gongsun Xiaoye was originally a little pepper, and her personality was extremely fierce. Miss Gongsun, we're on the same side as you. My daughter, Wanru, is young Master Shintu Miao's concubine, and also your future sister. Madame Xiao covered her face and cried out. Concubine? Yi Guchen heard and was slightly surprised. His gaze under the bamboo hat involuntarily looked at Xiao Wanru. The difference in status between a wife and a concubine was like heaven and earth. As if she felt Yi Guchen's gaze, Xiao Wanru's jade face was bashful, and she lowered her head, feeling a little ashamed. What, concubine? You want me to be that idiot's wife? I'm not even willing. Do you think you'll be proud of being a concubine? What a wretch! Gongsun Xiaoye's words were merciless. Her words made Xiao Wanru's cheeks burn as if they were on fire. Her face and ears were red, and she was extremely ashamed. Madame Zhao's face also alternated between green and white. Many gazes from the surroundings were strange and mocking. What a disgrace! Xiao Lai sighed deeply. He was almost angered to death by Madame Xiao. Wasn't it good to just watch quietly? Why did she have to interrupt? Now, Madame Xiao was like a pig looking into a mirror. She was in an awkward situation. Young Master Shin Tiyuan, say something. Madame Xiao looked at Shin Tiyuan for help. Shin Tiyuan snorted coldly and completely ignored Madame Xiao. However, he was indeed not convinced by Yi Guchen. Miss Gongsun, I don't believe that this kid can identify all 10 materials correctly. Let's not talk about the others. Just the last material alone, I'm afraid that not a single blacksmith here can identify it. However, how can this kid determine that this ore is called meteorite sand? Shin Tiyuan questioned, having looked at the list earlier. Gongsun Xiaoye also looked at Yi Guchen doubtfully. As far as she knew, this material was placed in the Gongsun family. Only those old men had found some clues after flipping through the ancient records. Their initial judgment was that it was meteorite sand. Although the person in front of her was wearing a bamboo hat, she could also determine that he was a youth. Was it possible for a youth to have more experience in identifying materials than the blacksmiths in the Gongsun family? Hearing this, Yi Guchen's expression was indifferent as he spoke. Meteorite sand is a fragment of a fallen star that falls into the sea and accumulates at the bottom of the sea for more than 100 years. It is nourished by the fertile soil at the bottom of the sea. The surface is black, and the interior is silvery white. It contains the power of the stars, and is a precious material for blacksmithing. If you still don't believe me, you can let a martial artist who cultivates a star technique hold meteorite sand and cultivate. It will be twice the result with half the effort. Yi Guchen's tone was indifferent and calm. Compared to him, it was Shintu Yuan who was more like an inexperienced junior, extremely arrogant and impatient. Men, test it. Gongsun Xiaoye waved her hand. She was also very curious. After that, they found a martial artist who cultivated a star technique. After testing it, the martial artist's face was filled with surprise. It is indeed effective. At this point, the truth was revealed. Everyone knew that this precious material was, without a doubt, the falling star sand. This made Shin Tiyuan's expression extremely ugly. It was as if someone had slapped him loudly in the face. As for Gongsun Xiaoye, her bright eyes stared unblinkingly at Yi Guchen. It was as if she was looking at an undiscovered treasure. Yi Guchen's performance in identifying materials was indeed amazing. What are you so proud of? There is still the next round of material selection. Shin Tiyuan's face was gloomy. He was unwilling to accept this result. As the blacksmithing genius of the Shin Tiyuan family, other than Gongsun Xiaoye, there were few in the younger generation who could beat him. How could he be willing to let an unknown brat take away the reputation that belonged to him? Chapter 397. After inviting Yi Guqin back, Gongsun Xiaoye returned to the second floor of the building. Hee, looks like this blacksmith convention is really a pleasant surprise. Gongsun Xiaoye giggled. She was in a good mood. Are you talking about that young man called Chen? LV Qinghan remained indifferent. She had no interest in blacksmithing, so she did not care if that young man called Chen was a blacksmith genius. That brat really exceeded my expectations. You have to know that the last few materials can only be identified by those old men in the family. Even Shintu Yuan was wrong about 2 of them. He really makes me look forward to it. Gongsun Xiaoye's eyes shone brightly as she clenched her small fists. Identifying materials is not the only way to blacksmith. Junior sister, let's continue watching. LV Qinghan shook her head and smiled. She felt that Gongsun Xiaoye was too rash. This was only the first round. It was too presumptuous to judge that the young man had a rare talent in blacksmithing. In the gem forging building, the second round of material selection had officially begun. Some attendants moved the stone tables away and replaced them with a huge stone table. On the stone table, there were many metal ores. Some were dazzling, some were golden, and some were dark. It was a dazzling array. The old man in charge of the convention took a step forward and said, "The second round of material selection begins now. Every blacksmith can choose 3 ores from the stone table in front of you. You will be ranked according to the rarity of the 3 ores. Only the top 10 blacksmiths are qualified to compete with Miss Gongsun. At the same time, the 3 ores that you choose will be the main material for your blacksmithing. Therefore, you need to consider not only the rarity of the materials, but also the degree of compatibility between them." After the old man finished speaking, all the blacksmiths frowned and looked serious. The difficulty of the second round was obviously much higher than the first round. Not only did one have to have a pair of eyes to choose the rarer materials. One also had to consider the compatibility between the materials. Some rare materials would not only not increase in strength when stacked together, but their attributes would also clash. The weapon forged would be no different from scrap metal. Therefore, this stage tested a blacksmith's foundation even more. Amongst those materials, I have put in quite a number of treasured materials. I wonder if that kid named Shen will be able to identify them. The person that Gongsun Xiaoye was most concerned about right now was Yi Guqin. Next was Shintu Yuan. Soon, all of the participating blacksmiths surrounded the stone platform and began to choose their materials. Shintu Yuan's gaze swept across the entire stone platform, his face full of confidence. With a single glance, there were no less than 10 types of rare materials that caught his eye. On the other hand, Yi Guqin glanced at the stone platform indifferently. His eyes flickered as if he was thinking about something. Some blacksmiths had already stepped forward to choose their materials. Shintu Yuan also stepped forward, and the first thing he did was to select a seemingly unremarkable jet black material. Why did young Master Shintu choose such an inconspicuous material? The surrounding blacksmiths cast sidelong glances in surprise. On the second floor, Gongsun Xiaoye's eyes lit up when she saw this. She said, "This kid from the Shintu clan is quite capable. This Shintu Yuan is indeed the most talented blacksmith here apart from you, junior sister." LV Qinghan also secretly nodded when she saw this. "May I ask what this material is, young Master Shintu?" A blacksmith asked. Since Shintu Yuan had obtained this material, it naturally belonged to him. Therefore, he was not stingy. With a hint of pride, he said, "This material is only recorded in the Shintu clan's records. It is normal that you do not know about it. This material is called tungsten steel rock. Although it looks unremarkable, it is a rare treasure material." So this is tungsten steel rock. I am really blind. Only young Master Shintu can identify it. I am ashamed. Many blacksmiths shook their heads, feeling that they were frogs at the bottom of a well. As a blacksmith genius from a super family, Shintu Yuan indeed had real ability. Young Master Shintu is really capable. Unlike a certain someone who only passed this round by luck. He is still at a loss even now in the second round. Madame Xiao spared no effort to flatter Shintu Yuan. At the same time, she glanced at Yi Guqin, who had not made a move since the beginning, and spoke in a strange tone. Because of Yi Guqin, she had been slapped in the face by Gongsun Xiaoye. Therefore, Madame Xiao naturally did not want to see Yi Guqin reveal his forging talent again. If Yi Guqin was really appreciated by Gongsun Xiaoye, how awkward would it be for her and Xiao Wanru? Yi Guqin ignored the barking. He was thinking about the combination of materials in his mind. In this round, as long as he could enter the top 10, he could exchange pointers with Gongsun Xiaoye. Therefore, Yi Guqin did not need to pick the rarest material to get first place. This was because when it came to forging, the combination of materials was still important. The rarity was secondary. After understanding this point, Yi Guqin finally made a move. He picked up a fiery red crystal. This ore was called the fire crystal. It was a type of crystal formed at the bottom of a volcano. Although it was not extremely precious, it was still a rare treasure. Yi Guqin's every move now would attract the attention of countless people. Therefore, when they saw Yi Guqin choose the fire crystal, some of the blacksmiths were shocked. This young man actually chose the fire crystal. Although the fire crystal is rare, it is definitely not the rarest material here. Did he make a mistake? He performed so amazingly in the first round. I thought he would pick some rare material. I know of such materials too. Immediately, many of the blacksmiths started to discuss. Seeing this, Shintu Yuan's eyes were filled with disdain. He sneered, maybe you saw the fire crystal's beautiful appearance and thought it was precious. Ha, how shallow. Shintu Yuan's heart was completely at ease. In the beginning, he really couldn't figure out Yi Guqin. After all, it wasn't easy for anyone to identify all 10 materials correctly. However, Yi Guqin's move made Shintu Yuan feel completely at ease. He was just a kid who got lucky. Gongsun Xiaoye, who was on the second floor of the loft, saw Yi Guqin's choice. Her face fell, and she said with a hint of disappointment, why did he choose the fire crystal? Although it is also precious, it is not the most precious material. Gongsun Xiaoye sighed. She thought she had picked up a treasure and that there would be a real opponent who could compete with her. However, the greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. Junior sister, I have already warned you. Don't judge a person too arbitrarily. Many people are superficial and have no inner qualities. LV Qinghan shook her head slightly. She did not know much about blacksmithing, so she did not think that Yi Guqin's previous performance was amazing. Sigh, let's see what he chooses next. Gongsun Xiaoye frowned. However, Yi Guqin's second choice caused an uproar. This kid is messing around. Even Gongsun Xiaoye's eyebrows were raised, and she was angry again. Chapter 398. It was because Yi Guqin's second choice was a piece of azure jade. The jade was called the 100-year cold heart jade. It was also a rare treasure material, but it wasn't the rarest material on this stone platform. But the reason why Gongsun Xiaoye was angry was because, the 100-year cold heart jade and the fire crystal. One was of the cold attribute, while the other was of the blazing attribute. These were two materials with completely opposite attributes that clashed with each other. Not to mention the real blacksmiths, even those who knew a little about blacksmithing would know. When materials with clashing attributes were combined together, not only would they not be able to bring out their full effect, but they would also clash with each other. The power would be chaotic, and the final result would be a scrap. Not to mention Gongsun Xiaoye, even an outsider like LV Qinghan could see the clues. She pursed her lips and said with a faint smile, this person is interesting and unexpected. What unexpected? He's just messing around. Even if he passes this round, how can he forge a divine weapon with these two materials when it's time to forge? Gongsun Xiaoye was so angry that she puffed up her cheeks. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, her face full of resentment. She thought she had found a good piece of jade, but in the end, Yi Guqin's choice was such an outsider. She was extremely disappointed. As for the other people who were choosing materials around the stone platform, they were all stunned when they saw Yi Guqin's choice. Merciless mockery and mockery rang out incessantly. Seeing this, Shintu Yuan said with a playful smile, "Everyone, don't be sarcastic to this little brother. Although he doesn't know blacksmithing, he still has some eyesight and can pass this round." Now, Shintu Yuan wanted Yi Guqin to pass this round, because he wanted to see how embarrassed Yi Guqin would be when it was time to forge. Like I said, that kid just got lucky. How can he compare to young Master Shintu? Madame Xiao did not stop talking. Even Xiao Wanru found out from the conversations of the other blacksmiths that Yi Guqin had made a very stupid choice. Young Master Yi, if you only wanted to attract Miss Gongsuan's attention, then you have indeed succeeded. Xiao Wanru sighed and shook her head. Previously, she was indeed ashamed because of Gongsun Xiaoye. But now, Yi Guqin's situation wasn't much better than hers. The vanity of a young girl made Xiao Wanru more willing to see the embarrassed Yi Guqin. Because of this, Xiao Wanru would not feel inferior just because she was a concubine. Around the stone platform, Shintu Yuan had already chosen 3 materials. That kind of eyesight made Gongsun Xiaoye secretly praise. The 3 materials that Shintu Yuan chose are the most precious ones on the stone table. What's even rarer is that the attributes of these materials don't conflict with each other, so they won't bring any difficulty to the forging process. Gongsun Xiaoye nodded to herself. On the other side, Yi Guqin had finally finished selecting the last piece of material. That's cloud essence. The disappointment in Gongsun Xiaoye's eyes deepened. The rarity of cloud marrow was considered average, and it was a non-elemental material with almost no special characteristics. Yi Guqin's choice was really mediocre. Forget it. Why was I so stupid to personally invite him back? Now it's me who's losing face. Gongsun Xiaoye was fuming. The more she looked at Yi Guqin, the more she disliked him. After the selection of materials, it was time for the judging. Young Master Shintu is really amazing. All 3 materials are top-notch. Even the old man who was hosting the competition couldn't help but praise. He checked them one by one. When it was Yi Guqin's turn, the old man sighed. The rarity is acceptable, but... The old man didn't finish his sentence, but everyone knew what he meant. The final result was out. Coincidentally, Yi Guqin was ranked 10th, and could enter the final stage of forging. Ha, congratulations. You're indeed someone that Miss Gongsun personally invited. You're really capable. I'm looking forward to your performance in forging. Shintu Yuan laughed. He was in an extremely good mood. He wasn't congratulating Yi Guqin, but mocking Gongsun Xiaoye at the same time. Shintu Yuan, if you say another word, I'll kick you out. Gongsun Xiaoye stood up. Her flat chest heaved up and down. She was extremely depressed. Ha, let's not talk about it anymore. I'll wait for his performance. Shintu Yuan laughed. Gongsun Xiaoye looked at Yi Guqin with some resentment. Obviously, Yi Guqin, who she personally invited back, made her lose face. Yi Guqin, who was under the bamboo hat and black veil, was indifferent from beginning to end. He didn't care about the eyes of the outside world. He was thinking in his heart. According to the Heavenly Works mineral collection, although the fire crystal and the 100-year chilling heart jade have conflicting attributes, if they're combined with the cloud essence, they'll form a more advanced material, the ice fire mystic heart essence. The value of a piece of ice fire mystic heart essence is probably equal to half of the treasures on the stone platform. However, to combine it into the ice fire mystic heart essence, not only does the temperature have to be controlled, but also the number of times it needs to be forged. In addition, it needs to be melted with a strange flame of the same origin as ice and fire to prevent it from conflicting. It's because of such harsh conditions that the method of fusion is almost lost. Only the Heavenly Works mineral collection that the old drunkard gave me has a brief record. Yiguchin sorted out his thoughts in his heart. He saw Yiguchin standing there motionlessly, as if he was stunned. Gongsun Xiaoya gritted her teeth, unable to vent her anger. Let's start forging. Gongsun Xiaoya snorted and said angrily. She was obviously not in a good mood. Oh, this kid is going to be unlucky. He actually made the little pepper of the Gongsun family unhappy. Some of the blacksmiths around cast pitiful gazes at Yiguchin. After the material selection round, only 10 people, including Shintu Yuan and Yiguchin, passed the round. Shintu Yuan was first, and Yiguchin was last. As for the forging round, it was not in the gem forging building, but in the forging room behind it. Gongsun Xiaoya and the top 10 blacksmiths went to the forging room together. Let's go and see how that kid embarrasses himself. Madame Xiao rubbed her swollen cheeks with a trace of resentment in her eyes. She could not wait to see Yiguchin make a fool of himself. Behind the gem forging building, 11 forging rooms had already been arranged. These 11 forging rooms were built according to the requirements of the blacksmith conference. The 4 sides, including the roof, were all transparent. Everyone in the surroundings could clearly see the situation in each forging room. Therefore, there was no possibility of cheating. It was fair and transparent. What kind of weapon could be forged depended entirely on the individual's ability. Let the competition begin. I'll make it clear that as long as anyone can forge a better weapon than me, he'll be able to choose any of the treasures of our Gongsun family. Even if it's a man, as long as he's not too ugly, I might even be willing to marry him. Gongsun Xiaoya's words were shocking once again. Miss Gongsun, please don't joke like that. You're already my cousin's fiancé, Shintu Yuan said solemnly. Do you think the weapon you forge can beat me? Gongsun Xiaoya said with her hands on her hips. That's not it. I don't even have the slightest confidence against Miss Gongsun, let alone others, Shintu Yuan said honestly. The blacksmiths here were all from the younger generation. Almost no one could beat Gongsun Xiaoya. Then what are you worried about? Gongsun Xiaoya snorted. Shintu Yuan's expression was a little embarrassed. He had indeed thought too much about it. Chapter 399. The 11 blacksmiths, including Gongsun Xiaoya, were ready. However, at this moment, Yiguchin suddenly spoke. May I ask if you have any forging tools, such as a hammer? As soon as Yiguchen's words came out, the surrounding people were once again stunned. As a blacksmith, he did not even have any forging tools. This time, Gongsun Xiaoya was really angry. Are you a blacksmith or not? I personally invited you here because I thought you had some ability. In the end, not only do you not understand the conflict between the attributes of the materials, you don't even have any forging tools. Gongsun Xiaoya was so angry that she almost went crazy. She wanted to smash Yiguchin's head with her hammer. It was like a swordsman who was used to using a sword that he was familiar with. Any blacksmith would have a forging tool that was suitable for them. Using a forging tool that was most suitable for them would increase the success rate of their forging. This was also the standard to judge whether a blacksmith was qualified or not. However, Yiguchin did not even have his own forging tool. It was indeed unreasonable. Letting such an unprofessional person in is an insult to us blacksmiths. That's right. He doesn't even have his own forging tool, yet he still wants to compete. Who is he looking down on? I suggest that this person be excluded. That's right. If he still wants to compete, we won't compete. A stone stirred up 1,000 ripples. Yiguchin's words completely enraged the blacksmiths. Other than Gongsun Xiaoya and Shintu Yuan, there was also Yiguchin himself. The other 8 blacksmiths actually said in unison that Yiguchin should be expelled. Hee. This kid puffed himself up at his own cost. Great, now he can't get out of this embarrassing situation. Madame Xiao, who was watching from the side, covered her mouth and laughed proudly. It was as if Yiguchin's expulsion was great news to her. Xiao Wanru also heaved a sigh of relief. Yi Guqin was really a blacksmithing genius. If Gongsun Xiaoya picked him, she would feel even more inferior. Sai, don't be like this. We are all in the same line of work. How can you be so heartless? At that moment, Shintu Yuan spoke. He was actually persuading the 8 blacksmiths. Yi Guqin, who was under the bamboo hat, was slightly surprised that Shintu Yuan would speak up for him. However, in the next moment, a playful smile appeared on Shintu Yuan's face. He looked at Yi Guqin and said with a faint smile, "Actually, I am also very curious. What kind of weapon can you forge with the fire crystal and the 100-year chilling heart jade? You have really broadened my horizons." His tone was filled with mockery. Yi Guqin understood. How could Shintu Yuan be so kind? He just wanted to continue watching him make a fool of himself. Shintu Yuan's words carried a lot of weight. Although the other 8 blacksmiths were still angry, they did not say anything else. Gongsun Xiaoya saw all of this in her eyes. Although her personality was shrewish and arrogant, she was not stupid. She knew what Shintu Yuan's motive was. She glanced at Yi Guqin and said, "Since you don't have anything in your stomach, why participate in the blacksmith's convention and embarrass yourself? I will give you 2 choices. One is to compensate you 50,000 crystal jades and give up your qualification. You can pretend that I did not personally ask you to stay. The other is to continue the competition. However, you will bear the consequences." Although Gongsun Xiaoya was arrogant, she was not evil. At that moment, she gave Yi Guqin the right to choose. Shintu Yuan's eyes flickered. He was really afraid that Yi Guqin would give up. Then, he would not be able to watch a good show. "I see that you are very confident in yourself. Do not give up. Continue the competition. Perhaps there will be a miracle," Shintu Yuan advised, kindly. Under the black veil, Yi Guqin's gaze was a little strange. If he really stayed and fused the ice and fire mysterious heart essence, then Shintu Yuan would have no chance at all. There was actually such a kind person in the world. He would rather let himself lose so that his opponent could stay and win. "Shintu Yuan, are you sure you want me to stay?" Yi Guqin asked. "Of course. Perhaps you can create a miracle and shock everyone, making us worship you." Seeing that Yi Guqin was persuaded by him, Shintu Yuan smiled. "All right, I will stay." Yi Guqin nodded slightly. Shintu Yuan not only helped him suppress the hostility of the other blacksmiths, but also tried his best to persuade him to stay. Facing such a kind person, how could Yi Guqin bear to refuse? "You are really a blockhead." Gongsun Xiaoya was completely disappointed in Yi Guqin. She no longer had any interest in him. A headstrong and self-opinionated person would not be welcomed anywhere. Next, a waiter brought in the forging tools. Of course, they were the most ordinary tools. It was impossible to give Yi Guqin any rare tools. Then, the 11 of them entered their own forging rooms. There was a forging furnace in the blacksmith room. Gongsun Xiaoya slowly raised her hand. Then, with a pop, a ball of jade-like flame appeared, bringing with it an extreme heat. That should be Miss Gongsun's rare fire, the Emerald Crystal Heart Fire. I heard that the Gongsun family obtained this rare fire from the battle with the Fire Tribe. The spectating blacksmith said in an extremely envious tone. A rare fire was something that all blacksmiths dreamed of. Unfortunately, only 1 in 10,000 blacksmiths had a rare fire. On the other side, Shintu Yuan looked at Gongsun Xiaoya with a faint jealousy in his eyes. Although he was a blacksmithing genius of the Shintu family, he did not have a rare fire. Shintu Yuan raised his hand, and a ball of bright yellow flame floated out. This was not a rare fire, but the fire of a type of monster beast. The fire of a monster beast was also rare. However, it could not be compared to the rare fire of the world. The other blacksmiths were even worse. They could only use their qi to ignite the forging furnace to smelt and forge. Yi Guqin's eyes flashed. he did not immediately summon the heavenly sun Xianming fire. This was because many people knew that Yi Guqin had a rare fire of the world, and the heavenly sun Xianming fire's characteristics were too obvious. It could be recognized at a glance. After thinking for a while, Yi Guqin summoned another type of fire that he had. The vermilion bird divine fire. A scarlet flame emerged from Yi Guqin's palm. As it tumbled, it vaguely formed the shape of a vermilion bird. However, it was somewhat illusory and blurry, so it was difficult for others to distinguish it clearly. That young man called Qin also has a type of monster beast fire. Yi Guqin was now the focus of everyone's attention. Many people were waiting to see him make a fool of himself. However, when Yi Guqin summoned the vermilion bird divine fire, it caused many people to be surprised. Yes, a lucky kid. Shintu Yuan's eyes darkened when he saw this. Obviously, Yi Guqin's possession of a monster beast fire had exceeded his expectations. However, Shintu Yuan did not know that Yi Guqin's vermilion bird divine fire was not on the same level as his monster beast fire. There was no comparison between the two. After all, the vermilion bird was an immemorial sacred beast. The power of its divine fire was comparable to the rare fire of the world. It was just that no one here knew what was good for them and could not recognize it at all. Even Gongsun Xiaoye did not care. She thought that her rare fire of the world was far superior to everyone else's. Regardless of whether it was Yi Guqin's fire or Shintu Yuan's monster beast fire, they were not worth mentioning in her eyes. This was also one of the reasons why Gongsun Xiaoye was so arrogant. Chapter 400. After the 11 blacksmiths summoned their flames, they began to forge for real. In fact, everyone could roughly judge a blacksmith's standard from the flames summoned. Gongsun Xiaoye possessed the emerald crystal core fire, so she was naturally the most qualified. Next was Shintu Yuan's demonic beast fire. Of course, although Yi Guqin's vermilion bird divine fire was of high quality, no one recognized it. Therefore, in their eyes, Yi Guqin's flame was at most on par with Shintu Yuan's. However, due to Yi Guqin's amateurish behavior, the surrounding people were not optimistic about him. Some blacksmiths even looked at Yi Guqin with disdain. The first step of forging is smelting, softening the materials moderately, an experienced old blacksmith said. The surrounding people stared intently at the 11 transparent forging rooms, afraid that they would miss out on even the slightest detail. Gongsun Xiaoye placed the materials into the furnace, then heated them up with the emerald crystal core fire. Her skillful technique made everyone secretly admire her. In addition, Shintu Yuan's performance was also very eye-catching. His control of the fire was very precise. Then, numerous gazes with a hint of playfulness and mockery looked towards the forging room where Yi Guqin was. Yi Guqin's technique was steady and calm. Although it was not as stunning as Gongsun Xiaoye's and Shintu Yuan's, it was not to the point of being flustered. It seems that this person knows a little about forging, the old blacksmith commented. However, they did not know. Gongsun Xiaoye and Shintu Yuan had been immersed in forging for a long time. They could be said to be geniuses who specialized in forging. As for Yi Guqin, he had always specialized in his own sword, martial arts, and cultivation realm. As for forging, other than learning from the old drunkard for a period of time, he had almost never practiced it. There was a fundamental difference between the two. Therefore, everyone here, including Gongsun Xiaoye and Shintu Yuan, did not know. Yi Guqin, who was competing with them, was only a blacksmith who had not learned his craft. Not long after, Gongsun Xiaoye was the first to complete the smelting process. She lifted her chin slightly, revealing a trace of pride. Indeed, Gongsun Xiaoye thought that this blacksmith's conference was her stage alone. Even Shintu Yuan was only a supporting character. Even Yi Guqin, who had brought a trace of interest to Gongsun Xiaoye, did not pay much attention to him now. This was because Yi Guqin had chosen two materials, the fire crystal and 100-year chilled heart jade. Gongsun Xiaoye took Shintu Yuan, Shintu Yuan, Shintu Yuan's Shintu Yuan, Shintu is a Shintu Yuan Shintu. Shintu Yu Shintu Shu was Shintu to a blacker Shent. Was Shintu Yuan, Shintu Yuan Shintu. After another quarter of an hour, Yi Chen and the other blacksmiths began to forge with their hammers. Although the forging hammers of those blacksmiths were not as good as those of Gongsun Xiaoye and the others, they were still top-notch spiritual weapons. On the other hand, Yi Chen's forging hammer was an ordinary low-grade spiritual inscription divine weapon. The outcome has already been decided. There are no other results. Forging hammers are extremely important to forging. A good forging hammer can produce effects comparable to a 10,000 refinements. That kid's chances are slim. The old blacksmith looked at Yi Chen and shook his head slightly. Madame Xiao and the others heaved a sigh of relief. Forging is related to the quality of the final materials. No one here can forge more than me. Gongsun Xiaoye was very confident in herself. She was the #1 blacksmith of the younger generation in the Gongsun family, having created the record of 80,000 refinements. On the other side, the corner of Shintu Yuan's mouth also carried a faint smile. He looked at Gongsun Xiaoye with fighting spirit hidden in his eyes. Everyone thought that my forging skills would be slightly inferior to Gongsun Xiaoye's, but now, it's time for me to show my true strength, Shintu Yuan thought to himself. After a brief moment, the 11 blacksmiths began to repeatedly temper the materials. Even those who were not blacksmiths knew. The more times they were forged, the better the quality of the materials. The difference between the quality of the 1,000 refinements and the 10,000 refinements was like heaven and earth. Clang! 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 Gongsun Xiaoye was petite, but she was vigorous when forging. She held the fire cloud hammer in her small hand and hammered the materials at an extremely fast speed. Shintu Yuan was also hammering. Although his speed was slightly slower than Gongsun Xiaoye's, his strength was slightly higher. Yi Chen, on the other hand, was completely focused on hammering. He seemed to have returned to the state when he was forging the meteorite soft sword under the guidance of the old drunkard. He was focused, serious, and meticulous. Outside the arena, the blacksmiths who had originally scoffed at Yi Chen were looking at Yi Chen with surprise. That kind of focused and serious expression was moving. Looks like that kid isn't really an amateur. The old blacksmith nodded secretly. For a moment, a small number of blacksmiths changed their view of Yi Chen. But that was it. After all, Yi Chen's choice of materials meant that his final product would most likely be a waste. Forging was not something that could be completed in a short period of time. All the spectators in the arena fell silent. Only the clanging sounds of forging could be heard continuously. However, no one there, including Gongsun Xiaoye and the rest, noticed it. On the top floor of the gem forging building, a middle-aged man in cloth robes stood with his hands behind his back, quietly watching the battle below. If Gongsun Xiaoye saw this, she would definitely scream. This middle-aged man in cloth robes was the head of the Gongsun family, and also her father, Gongsun Xianlong. Gongsun Xianlong looked down and nodded with satisfaction in his eyes. This girl's forging skills have not fallen behind. She might be able to challenge the 100,000 refinements this time. The only one here who is qualified to compete with her is that kid from the Shintu family. Gongsun Xianlong secretly judged. It was not that he did not see Yi Chen. However, Yi Chen's previous performance was somewhat unbearable for a blacksmith. He would definitely not catch the eye of a 4-star blacksmith like Gongsun Xianlong. This young man named Chen's forging skills are quite normal. I wonder if he has the ability to 10,000 refinements. Gongsun Xianlong casually glanced at him and did not pay too much attention. If he could not even 10,000 refinements, there was no need to pay attention to him. The 11 blacksmiths below naturally did not know that their every move was being watched by Gongsun Xianlong, a 4-star blacksmith. Chapter 401. As time passed, some of the 11 blacksmiths could no longer hold on. Forging wasn't as simple as forging materials. This process was extremely taxing on one's physical strength, true energy, and even one's soul. It could be said that every strike of the hammer was a painstaking effort. This was also the reason why those true master blacksmiths were so revered and respected. There were even some master blacksmiths who would casually wave their hands after forging rare divine weapons, and countless experts would be willing to serve them at their beck and call. Finally, one of the participating blacksmiths was drenched in sweat. His lips were pale, and his true energy was exhausted. He felt dizzy and collapsed to the ground. 8,120 refinements. There was a person recording the number of refinements. 8,000 refinements. Although it's not high, it's still acceptable, said the old blacksmith. However, Gongsun Xianlong, who was on the top floor of the jewel forging building, didn't even look at him. Anything below 10,000 refinements was trash. If a blacksmith couldn't even reach 10,000 refinements, it meant that his future was limited. The blacksmith's face was ashen as he slowly shook his head. There was no need to continue the process. He had already lost. As time passed, another blacksmith couldn't hold on anymore. 9,250 refinements, said the person recording calmly. Then a third blacksmith. 10,300 refinements. Already 10,000 refinements. That's not bad, said the old blacksmith in admiration. The blacksmith who'd surpassed 10,000 refinements began the next step. After that, more and more blacksmiths stopped forging. Among them, the highest was only 21,000 refinements. That was enough to earn everyone's praise. Even Gongsun Xianlong, who was watching from the shadows, nodded slightly. Such a person can be considered for the Gongsun family, thought Gongsun Xianlong. At present, only 3 of the 11 participants were still forging. To everyone's surprise, Yi Guqian was one of the 3 people. Could it be that we've misjudged him? The spectating blacksmiths were extremely surprised. They looked suspiciously at Yi Guqian in the forging room. At this time, even Gongsun Xiaoye and Shintu Yuan slowed down their forging speed due to fatigue. But Yi Guqian, from the moment he held the casting hammer until now, had maintained an almost perfect speed without the slightest bit of delay. Even those who were prejudiced against Yi Guqian knew that the young man in the bamboo hat was no ordinary person. This kid is out of my expectations. Gongsun Xianlong was slightly surprised on the top floor of the jewel forging building. At first, he had doubted whether Yi Guqian could 10,000 refine. Now, Yi Guqian had smithied more than 30,000 times, and he did not look tired at all. Gongsun Xianlong already had the intention of roping Yi Guqian into his Gongsun family. On the other side, Gongsun Xiaoye and Shintu Yuan were also paying attention to their opponents. When they saw that Yi Guqian was still persevering, they were stunned. However, they didn't care too much about it because Yi Guqian's choice of materials meant that he wouldn't have a finished product in the end. Clang! 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 Time passed by amidst the crisp sounds of hammering. The further they went, the more astonished the crowd became. It's already 70,000 refinements. A young blacksmith said with a trembling voice. 70,000 refinements was already an extremely shocking number. However, Yi Guqian and the other 2 showed no signs of stopping. In the end, when the person recording the number of times reported Yi Guqian's 100,000 refinements, the scene was already in an uproar. This was definitely a record for the younger generation of blacksmiths. I can't take it anymore. Gongsun Xiaoye's face was pale at this moment, clearly exhausted. Her previous record was 80,000 refinements, which had already crushed the group of blacksmithing geniuses in the Gongsun family. This 100,000 refinements had already exceeded her own limit. Even Gongsun Xiaoye was very satisfied with herself. However, what made her angry was that Shintu Yuan was still persevering. It was still Yi Guqian, who had infuriated her previously, who also didn't stop. I'm actually only 3rd this time. This result was completely out of Gongsun Xiaoye's expectations. However, Shintu Yuan didn't surpass Gongsun Xiaoye by much. His final number of hammering stopped at 110,300 times. After that, in the entire venue, only Yiguchen's forging room continued to resonate with the sound of hammering. The sound of metal colliding was like a heavy hammer that ruthlessly smashed into everyone's hearts. This kid is still persevering. Shintu Yuan's face was filled with shock. He was unwilling to believe the truth in front of him. Gongsun Xiaoye's red lips were also wide open. She had previously thought that Yiguchen was staying because he was obstinate and opinionated. However, from the looks of it now, the person who was truly superficial was actually her. As for Madame Xiao, who had been mocking and hooting at the beginning, at this moment, her eyes were also filled with shock. She didn't dare to speak carelessly anymore. Could it be that young Master Yi is really a blacksmith? Xiao Wanru's jade-like hand slightly covered her mouth, somewhat in disbelief. The surrounding people's gazes towards Yiguchen had completely changed. At this moment, no one dared to mock Yiguchen's amateurish actions anymore. This was because Yiguchen's current performance had completely shocked them. Just as everyone was feeling shocked, there was a strange movement from Yiguchen's forging room. With a crisp cracking sound, his hammer, a low-grade spiritual inscription's divine weapon, was directly shattered. This scene was beyond everyone's expectations. The forging hammer shattered. The old blacksmith's eyes widened, and he immediately jumped up and down anxiously. They still wanted to know what the limit of the young man called Chen's forging was. How could they be willing to stop just like that? In the forging room, Yiguchen was stunned as he looked at the smithing hammer that had been shattered into pieces. He suddenly recalled that the hammer that he had used to forge 100,000 refinements was the old drunkard's heavenly spirit vibrating hammer. Its quality was probably far superior to Gongsun Xiaoye's fire cloud hammer. This low-grade forging hammer naturally couldn't satisfy Yiguchen's needs. However, Yiguchen didn't feel that it was a pity. Although he hadn't reached his limit, if he could fuse the ice-fire mysterious heart essence, he could still win first place. Just as Yiguchen was about to stop the forging, a figure suddenly appeared in front of Yiguchen's forging room. Use my forging hammer. This middle-aged man in cloth robes looked at Yiguchen with a fiery gaze and handed over a dark forging hammer. Who are you? This is the blacksmith convention. How can an outsider disturb the competition? Seeing that someone was going to hand Yiguchen a forging hammer, Shintu Yuan immediately stopped what he was doing, stood up, and berated loudly. Yiguchen's performance had already exceeded his expectations. If he continued forging, Shintu Yuan wasn't sure how high the quality of the materials would be in the end. While Shintu Yuan was berating, Gongsun Xiaoye's delicate body trembled. She shouted in surprise, "Stinky Dad, why are you here?" As soon as she said that, the crowd went into an uproar. Shintu Miao's face stiffened, and he was momentarily speechless. Chapter 402. The head of the Gongsun family, Gongsun Xianlong, was obsessed with blacksmithing. At the same time, he was a 4-star blacksmith with an extraordinary status. With Shintu Yuan's status and identity, he was not qualified to meet Gongsun Xianlong. Therefore, he did not know that the middle-aged man in plain clothes in front of him was Gongsun Xiaoye's father, the head of the Gongsun family. I'm here to watch my daughter's competition, and you call me an outsider? Gongsun Xuanlong's eyes darkened. Moreover, he could see that Shintu Yuan did not want Yiguchen to continue forging. However, how could Gongsun Xianlong give up the opportunity to test a talent? As a blacksmith, how can you be so jealous? Gongsun Xianlong said coldly as he waved his hand. A strong wave of true qi spread out and hit Shintu Yuan's body. He fell like a kite and landed heavily on the ground, his face covered in dust. If Gongsun Xianlong had not been worried that Shintu Yuan was still participating in the competition, his hand would have broken his bones. I'm sorry. I was blind. Shintu Yuan stood up awkwardly, gritted his teeth, and bowed. Then, he returned to his forging room. He did not dare to be impudent in front of Gongsun Xianlong. Damn it, This kid was chosen by the head of the Gongsun family. However, it doesn't matter. The two materials he chose conflicted with each other and could not form a finished product. When the time comes, the head of the Gongsun family will know how blind he was. Shintu Yuan suppressed his anger. When he revealed his hidden strength, it was even stronger than Gongsun Xiaoya's. Originally, he could have shocked everyone in this blacksmith convention. However, everyone's eyes were now on Yiguchen. Even Gongsun Xianlong personally appeared and lent his forging hammer to Yiguchen. How could Shintu Yuan not be angry? On the other side, Gongsun Xianlong looked at Yiguchen, who was covered by a bamboo hat, and said, "Junior, you're called Chen, right? I'll lend you my forging hammer. Show me all your strength." "Thank you, family head Gongsun." Yiguchen cupped his fists. Through Gongsun Xiaoya, he learned that the plainly dressed man before him was the head of the Gongsun family. Yiguchen took the hammer from Gongsun Xianlong and weighed it in his hand. It was very heavy and of high quality. Although it was still inferior to the old drunkard's heavenly spirit resonating hammer, it was still a rare forging tool. Gongsun Xianlong nodded and quietly retreated to the side. Gongsun Xiaoya stopped what she was doing and crossed her arms in front of her chest, staring at Yiguchen. Phew, Yiguchen exhaled slightly and secretly used the flawless Vajra body. Vigorous qi and blood flowed vigorously in his body. Clang! 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 The sounds of the hammers were crisp and clear. Every hammer strike was extremely steady, but there was also a rhythm to it. At first glance, this kid's forging method seems ordinary and unremarkable. Now that I look at it, it's rather ingenious. Even a 4-star forging master like Gongsun Xianlong was amazed. How would he know that Yiguchen was taught by the old drunkard? The old drunkard was not from the Saint Origin dynasty, but was a forging master from the Nantian region. There was no comparison between the two of them. At this moment, Yiguchen was the only one in the entire place who was still forging. The number of times he was hammering increased exponentially. 130,000 refinements, 150,000 refinements, 180,000 refinements, 200,000 refinements. Just as Yiguchen hammered down with 200,000 refinements, the sound of metal colliding was like thunder, echoing throughout the entire jeweled forging building. Boom! A dazzling brilliance was emitted from the material. That pure wave of energy shocked everyone. This is treasure light. It's a top-grade material. Gongsun Xianlong said with a hint of surprise. Treasure light was something that could only happen once in a blue moon even with his status as a 4-star forging master. It required luck. But now, Yiguchen had hammered the material to this level with 200,000 refinements. It was extremely shocking. Even Gongsun Xianlong lost his composure, let alone Gongsun Xiaoya, Shintu Yuan, and the other forging masters. Even LV Qinghan, who was watching from the side, was surprised for the first time. Even an outsider like her could sense that Yiguchen's material was extraordinary. As for Madame Xiao, she was blinded by the brilliance. Her swollen face was drained of blood. Looking at the expressions of the people around him, from the initial disdain to the current shock, Yiguchen's heart was as calm as an ancient well. This should be enough, Yiguchen thought to himself. Actually, 200,000 refinements was far from Yiguchen's limit. When he was in the Qi refinement realm, he was able to reach Gongsun Xiaoya's record of 100,000 refinements. Now that his cultivation was much higher than before, how could his limit be just 200,000 refinements? It was just that Yiguchen did not want to attract too much attention. It would be troublesome if that happened. So, 200,000 refinements was enough. Of course, if Gongsun Xianlong knew Yiguchen's true thoughts, he would not just be surprised. You're very good. The Gongsun family strongly invites you to join us, Gongsun Xianlong invited with a smile. Stupid dad, the competition isn't over yet. Gongsun Xiaoya shouted. Actually, she wanted to remind Gongsun Xianlong that Yiguchen's material was difficult to forge into a divine weapon. Gongsun Xuanlong's mind turned slightly, and the smile on his face faded slightly. Ha, little brother, why don't we end the competition here? As for the knowledge about material attributes, after you join the Gongsun family, I can make the decision to open the library to you. Obviously, Gongsun Xianlong thought that he was giving Yiguchen a way out. He recognized Yiguchen's forging talent very much. But in terms of material attributes, it was really unsightly. It could even be said that he had not even reached the entry level. Yiguchen naturally understood the meaning behind Gongsun Xuanlong's words. Gongsun Xianlong was offended by his choice of fire crystal and 100-year cold heart jade. Thank you for your kindness, Master Gongsun. I will definitely complete this competition, Yiguchen said calmly. He was not participating in the competition to join the Gongsun family, but for the snow clay embryo. Humph, you don't know what's good for you. Not far away, Shintu Yuan sneered. Even Gongsun Xiaoye was secretly annoyed, and stomped her feet. She reminded Gongsun Xianlong because she wanted to save some face for Yiguchen at the end. Yiguchen was so outstanding in forging. If the final product was not good, how embarrassing would that be? Seeing this, Gongsun Xianlong shook his head slightly and laughed. It's good to be young. When he fails this time, he should be less arrogant and join the Gongsun family with peace of mind. Chapter 403. Gongsun Xianlong did not mind Yiguchen's rejection. In fact, he admired Yiguchen's stubbornness. In his opinion, Yiguchen knew that he would fail at the end, but he still wanted to continue. This spirit was worthy of recognition. Yiguchen glanced at Gongsun Xuanlong's eyes and knew what he was thinking. Indeed, one can only see further when one stands at a high place. Yiguchen shook his head. If he had not met the old drunkard, perhaps he would not have seen as much as Gongsun Xianlong. However, this also encouraged Yiguchen to leave the Saint Origin dynasty and head to a wider world. Yiguchen dismissed the thoughts in his mind and focused on the next step of forging. The next step after forging was to combine the materials. By stacking materials of different attributes on top of each other and fusing them together. If the elements of the metal were compatible, its advantages would be fully displayed in this step. If the elements clashed, the result would be obvious. All the materials would be wasted. This was also the reason why all the blacksmiths were not optimistic about Yiguchen's chances. The materials he chose almost completely clashed with each other. It was as if an outsider had randomly chosen them. Gongsun Xiaoye, Shintu Yuan, and the others no longer paid attention to Yiguchen and focused on their forging. In their opinion, Yiguchen's outcome was already decided. There was no need to pay too much attention to it. Gongsun Xianlong also looked at Yiguchen indifferently. He did not want to see Yiguchen's final product. He was just wondering where Yiguchen would fail. This step is the most crucial. Yiguchen took a deep breath. He dismissed all distracting thoughts and focused on forging. What he wanted to forge was a sword. Because Yiguchen only knew how to forge swords now. Among the forging techniques that the old drunkard passed down to me, the best one is naturally the forbidden forging technique. Human soul forging sword, dual cultivation of sword and life. However, I can't use it now. Yiguchen thought. Refining swords with human souls, dual cultivation of sword and life. This forbidden forging technique was comparable to a god-tier forging technique. As for the god-tier forging technique, it was possible to forge a famed ancient sword. Furthermore, the old drunkard had repeatedly warned him that this forbidden technique could only be used once in a person's lifetime. The sword he forged would follow Yiguchen for the rest of his life. Yiguchen was also preparing to use this forbidden forging technique in the future to forge an accompanying divine weapon that was comparable to a famed primordial sword. Therefore, it was impossible for him to use it here. If that's the case, I'll have to use other casting techniques, Yiguchen thought to himself. The old drunkard had taken Yiguchen as his disciple and had even passed down his forbidden forging technique to Yiguchen. Naturally, he wouldn't be stingy with other casting techniques. In his spare time, Yiguchin had also reviewed those forging techniques, but he had never actually used them. Just as Yiguchin was deep in thought, he heard a burst of noise from the periphery. Almost everyone's gaze fell on Gongsun Xiaoye. This was because she had already used the Gongsun family's most famous casting technique. Green Lotus Fire Accumulation Casting Technique. Gongsun Xiaoye controlled the emerald crystal heart fire, and as the flames gathered, it vaguely formed the shape of a green lotus. As for the materials that had already been forged, they were wrapped in the fire lotus. Seeing this scene, even Gongsun Xianlong had a look of satisfaction in his eyes as he nodded slightly. This girl has indeed put in a lot of hard work in her forging. Her green lotus fire accumulation casting technique is already at 70% proficiency. Gongsun Xianlong sighed in his heart. His daughter was indeed a genius in the field of forging. At this moment, Shinto Yuan, who was on the other side, also used one of the Shinto family's casting techniques. However, the Shinto family wasn't a family that specialized in forging, so his casting techniques were naturally inferior to the green lotus fire accumulation casting technique. Even so, Shinto Yuan's casting techniques were superior to some of the other participating blacksmiths. As for Yiguchin, before using his casting techniques, he had to first fuse the materials. In order to successfully fuse the ice and fire mystic heart essence. Other than the number of times he had to forge it, there was also the temperature, etc. Most importantly, he had to fuse it with a flame of the same origin as ice and fire. Coincidentally, Yiguchin's Heavenly Sun Mystic Underworld Fire met this requirement. He thought for a moment, and as he used the Heavenly Sun Mystic Underworld Fire, he wrapped it with the Vermilion Bird Divine Fire. This way, no one would know Yiguchin's true background. After that, Yiguchin carefully stacked the Infernal Crystal, 100-year Cold Heart Jade, and Cloud Essence together. As he forged and fused them, he secretly used the Heavenly Sun Mystic Underworld Fire to heat them up. As time passed, the three materials gradually fused together. Faintly, there seemed to be some kind of fluctuation that was about to be emitted. At the same time, Gongsun Xiaoye, Shinto Yuan, and the rest relied on their own casting techniques. The divine weapons that they had forged were almost ready. Gongsun Xiaoye's divine weapon was a sword, and she had fused the spiritual seal that she had prepared beforehand into it. After going through the complicated forging of the green lotus fire accumulation casting technique, it was finally ready. The moment the sword appeared, it emitted an incomparably resplendent brilliance. It's a success. Gongsun Xiaoye jumped 3 feet high in excitement. Her delicate little face was full of sweat, but there was a trace of pride and joy. Well done. Although it's only a low-grade divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions, it's really rare for someone your age. Gongsun Xianlong took the sword. The body of the sword shone with a cold light, and the blade was as shiny as snow. Being able to forge a low-grade divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions meant that Gongsun Xiaoye was a top 2-star blacksmith. She could even be considered a 3-star blacksmith. With her talent, it was possible that she could become a 4-star blacksmith in the future. The surrounding crowd also burst out in praise. Tisk, tsk, tsk. She's indeed the young lady of the Gongsun family. Wanru, you must build a good relationship with her after the competition. Do you understand? We can't afford to offend such a talented blacksmith. Seeing this, Madame Xiao sternly warned Xiao Wanru. Xiao Wanru's lips curled into a bitter smile. Gongsun Xiaoye had completely crushed her in every aspect. Such shocking talent in blacksmithing also meant that Gongsun Xiaoye's status would be extraordinary in the future. Thinking of this, Xiao Wanru sighed in her heart. At the same time, her gaze involuntarily turned to Yiguchin, who was still forging. I wonder how talented young Master Yi is in blacksmithing. Xiao Wanru thought to herself. In her heart, she imagined that if Yiguchin really had talent comparable to Gongsun Xiaoye's in blacksmithing, then even if his status was not as high as Shinto Miao's, it would not be too far off. At this moment, the divine weapon that Shinto Yuan had forged was also out. He had forged an axe, and its quality had also reached the level of a low-grade divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions. However, it was slightly inferior to Gongsun Xiaoye's sword. It's a pity that my blacksmithing skills are not as good as the green lotus fire forging technique of the Gongsun family. Otherwise, my divine weapon would definitely not be inferior to hers. Shintu Yuan was unconvinced. However, precious blacksmithing skills were like martial arts skills. They were very rare and could not be obtained easily. That fellow is still forging. Could it be that he doesn't have any blacksmithing skills? Shintu Yuan's gaze involuntarily turned to Yiguchen. Not only him, but Gongsun Xiaoye, Gongsun Xianlong, LV Qinghan, and the people from the Shao family all had their gazes fixed on Yiguchen. This was because until now, among all the blacksmiths, only Yiguchen had not used any blacksmithing skills. This made people wonder if Yiguchen really had blacksmithing skills. I'm almost done forging. Next, I'll use that blacksmithing skill, Yiguchen said to himself as he let out a light sigh. Chapter 404. There was no doubt about the importance of casting techniques to a blacksmith. It could be said that a top-notch casting technique could establish the foundation of a blacksmith family. Some rare casting techniques were almost never taught to outsiders. This was also why Shintu Yuan was jealous of Gongsun Xiaoye's green lotus fire forging technique. However, it was also because of the rarity of casting techniques that most blacksmiths did not have any casting techniques and could only forge weapons using ordinary methods. Yiguchen, on the other hand, had been fusing and forging until now. He had not used his casting skills yet. Therefore, the surrounding people misunderstood and thought that Yiguchen might not have any casting techniques. Gongsun Xianlong was not surprised by this. Casting techniques were rarer than martial arts, and it was indeed impossible for an unorthodox blacksmith to have any casting techniques. In his opinion, Yiguchen should be the kind of blacksmith who had some talent but no background, so it was normal that he did not have any casting techniques. Sigh, what a pity. 200,000 refined materials, but no casting techniques. Gongsun Xiaoye shook her head regretfully. Shintu Yuan sneered. So what if it was 200,000 refined materials? Without a casting technique, it was impossible to forge a good divine weapon just by relying on this kind of forging. During this time, the divine weapons forged by the other blacksmiths in the competition were also out. However, the quality of those divine weapons were mostly ordinary spiritual weapons, and the highest was only a supreme-grade spiritual weapon. There was a huge gap between Gongsun Xiaoye and Shintu Yuan's results. If there were no surprises, the winner of this blacksmith convention would undoubtedly be Gongsun Xiaoye. Little brother, you have already tried your best. Without casting techniques, it is very difficult to forge a divine weapon. If you join the Gongsun family, you may be able to obtain the green lotus fire forging technique in the future. Gongsun Xianlong had a faint smile on his face. He asked himself, Yiguchen should be tempted now that I've even taken out the Gongsun family's secret forging technique. Unfortunately, Yiguchen was still indifferent. When the fire crystal, the 100-year cold heart jade, and the cloud marrow were about to merge together, the light in Yiguchen's eyes under the bamboo hat suddenly became extremely sharp. At the same time, a terrifying transparent spiritual energy gushed out from Yiguchen's sea of consciousness and directly seeped into the flame. Fire Soul Dual Casting. Yiguchen shouted in his heart. His incomparably vigorous soul force controlled the flames and completely wrapped the materials together. This is casting. All the blacksmiths who were watching the battle were shocked. Even if he had used the casting technique, they would not have been so shocked. However, Yiguchen's casting technique was no weaker than the green lotus fire casting technique of the Gongsun family. It might even be better. Even Gongsun Xianlong lost his composure as he stared blankly at Yiguchen, who had just performed his forging technique. What kind of casting technique is this? Gongsun Xiaoye's rosy little mouth was wide open. In addition, Shintu Yuan, LV Qinghan, and the 3 people from the Xiao family were all staring at Yiguchen. They had never seen such a casting technique before. At this moment, Yiguchen's expression was focused. Fire Soul Dual Casting used spiritual energy to precisely control the flames and seep into every inch of the materials. This kind of forging technique had extremely high requirements for flames and soul power. In other words, even if this Fire Soul Dual Casting was given to Gongsun Xiaoya, Shintu Yuan, and the others, they would not be able to perform it. Only Yigu Chen, whose soul power was far beyond that of ordinary people, could use it. Along with the Fire Spirit Dual Casting, the 3 materials finally fused together perfectly and faintly transformed into a sword embryo. Boom! At the same time, an incomparably vigorous shockwave blasted the 5 transparent walls of Yiguchen's casting room apart. An extremely resplendent light also shot out from the depths of the flames. It was as if a rare treasure had been born. That is. Gongsun Xianlong stared at the depths of the flame. It was as if he wanted to see the source of the brilliance. At this moment, Gongsun Xiaoya and Shintu Yuan were already speechless. They simply did not know what Yiguchen had forged. This is not a shockwave that can be emitted by a piece of trash. Gongsun Xiaoya was inexplicably shocked and could not regain her senses for a moment. As for Shintu Yuan, he was even more frozen in place. His eyes were bloodshot as he stared at the depths of the flame. He did not believe it, nor did he want to believe it. Although he was dissatisfied that he had lost to Gongsun Xiaoya, he did not feel anything. After all, Gongsun Xiaoya was a famous forging genius. However, if he had lost to Yiguchen, Shintu Yuan would definitely not accept it. He did not believe that he would lose to a person with an unknown identity who was hiding his head and showing his tail. I don't believe it, I definitely don't believe it. I want to see the finished product. At this moment, Shintu Yuan was still hoping for a fluke. As the shockwave dissipated, Yiguchen also withdrew his spiritual energy and flames. A sword embryo landed in his hand. Yiguchen did not fuse his spiritual seal into it, as there was no need to. Although this sword embryo was not a spiritual inscription divine weapon, it was better than one. At a glance, the sword embryo was 3 feet long, and it was surrounded by brilliance. The body of the sword looked like it was carved out of jade and crystal. The strangest thing was that the sword embryo was translucent. One could clearly see that there were 2 kinds of brilliance, one red and one icy blue, swirling within it like fish. Not to mention other things, just from its appearance alone, this sword embryo was far superior to other divine weapons. This sword embryo should be called a work of art. That is. Gongsun Xianlong looked at the sword embryo, his eyes slightly dazed. In his vague memory, he seemed to have seen this material in a dusty ancient book in his family. However, at this moment, he was so shocked that he could not recall it for a while. This kid's forging skills are really amazing. That sword embryo is so beautiful, one look and you can tell that it is not an ordinary item. The surrounding forging masters were all in awe. Gongsun Xiaoya looked suspiciously at the sword embryo in Yiguchen's hand. Wasn't it said that the fire crystal and the 100-year cold heart jade clashed with each other, and were difficult to fuse? Why was Yiguchen able to fuse them, and it did not seem to be a waste? Not only was Gongsun Xiaoya suspicious, Shintu Yuan was the first to stand up and say, "Kid, I don't care what special method you used, but a divine weapon is not just good looking. Maybe your sword embryo looks good on the surface, but it is so weak that it can't even withstand a single blow." Shintu Yuan gritted his teeth, unwilling to let Yiguchen steal the limelight. "What do you want?" Yiguchen said indifferently. "Do you dare to compete with the divine weapon that I have forged?" Shintu Yuan held the axe that he had forged with extreme confidence. Yiguchen shook his head slightly and did not say anything else. In the next moment, he held the sword embryo in his hand, poured his true qi into it, and then threw it out. Boom! An incomparably terrifying force of ice and fire spread out with a loud bang. That gorgeous sword embryo drew an afterimage, piercing through the air and emitting a violent screech. Shintu Yuan's face was suddenly shocked, and he hurriedly blocked with the axe in his hand. Whoosh! Almost like cutting through tofu, the sword embryo directly cut the axe in half, and then flew out close to Shintu Yuan's cheek. Finally, it made a turn and fell back into Yiguchen's hand. Is this enough? An extremely calm voice came out from Yiguchen's mouth. A bloody wound appeared on Shintu Yuan's cheek, and a drop of blood seeped out. If that sword embryo had been just a little closer to his head, plop. The brush with death actually caused Shintu Yuan's legs to go soft, and he directly knelt on the ground. Chapter 405. Silence. It was so quiet that one could hear the rapid breathing of some blacksmiths. At this moment, the entire gem-casting building had sunk into a strange deathly silence. Then, there was a complete uproar. Oh my God, he broke a divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions with one slash. This sword embryo is at least a superior grade divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions. No, it's not just that. This sword embryo has yet to be infused with a spiritual imprint, so it's not a divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions. It's hard to imagine. If it were infused with a spiritual imprint, it would probably become a supreme-grade divine weapon with spiritual inscriptions. I think this sword embryo has the foundation of a divine weapon with mystical inscriptions. All the blacksmiths were whispering to each other. The performance of Yiguchen's sword embryo was too shocking. It was definitely a rare divine weapon. However, the most important thing was that the materials used by Yiguchen were not only not of the highest quality, but also of conflicting attributes. To be able to use materials of conflicting attributes to forge such a divine weapon in the end, how many blacksmiths present could do that? Even the old blacksmiths were full of praises and felt ashamed of their inferiority. Shintu Yuan, who was kneeling on the ground due to his weak legs, felt his mind go blank. The work that he was proud of after putting in so much effort was broken by Yiguchen with one slash. Looking at the halved axe on the ground, Shintu Yuan lost the ability to think. And Yiguchen did not care about Shintu Yuan at all. His tone was calm as he said to Gongsun Xiaoye, "Do you want to compete too?" "No. No need." Gongsun Xiaoye, who had a fiery personality like a little chili, stuttered as she replied. Even Shintu Yuan's divine weapon had been broken by Yiguchen with one slash. Even if the quality of the sword that she had forged was slightly better, it would not be much better. At this moment, if she still had doubts, she would be the only one losing face. "Young friend, can you let me take a look at this sword embryo?" Gongsun Xianlong asked after some hesitation. Generally speaking, any sword forged by a blacksmith, unless it was specially forged for others, would have the right to use it first. If the blacksmith was not willing, others would not even have the right to touch it. This was an internal rule in the smithing industry, so Gongsun Xianlong probed. Furthermore, his tone had changed from junior and little brother to little friend. From this, one could see the change in his attitude. Without any hesitation, Yiguchen tossed the sword embryo to Gongsun Xianlong. He didn't care about this sword embryo. Gongsun Xianlong hurriedly rushed forward and raised his hands, as if he was holding a treasure. Even Gongsun Xiaoye was dumbfounded by his attitude. When had she ever seen her father act so cautiously? Impossible. Could this be? Gongsun Xuanlong's trembling hand brushed past the sword embryo. That kind of harmonious feeling made it hard to believe that it was formed by the fusion of two completely different materials. "Smelly Dad, did you see anything?" Gongsun Xiaoye asked curiously. It was not only her. Everyone else present was also staring at Gongsun Xianlong. "It can't be wrong. I've seen it in an ancient book in my clan. The material of this sword embryo is called the Icefire Mystic Heart Essence." Gongsun Xianlong said in a trembling voice. "Icefire Mystic Heart Essence? What kind of material is that?" Gongsun Xiaoye was puzzled. The other smiths were the same. They didn't know what the Icefire Mystic Heart Essence formed by the fusion of the fire crystal and the 100-year cold heart jade was. This ice-fire mystic heart essence is a supreme material. It can even be used to forge tribulation divine weapons. Gongsun Xianlong couldn't hide his excitement as he spoke. Everyone, including Gongsun Xiaoye, was speechless. Even their breathing seemed to have stopped. They might not know the value of the ice-fire mystic heart essence. However, they still knew the meaning of heavenly tribulation weapons. Tribulation divine weapons were above mystical rune divine weapons. There wasn't a single tribulation divine weapon in the entire Saint Origin dynasty. There was only one requirement to become a tribulation divine weapon, and that was to be able to withstand the baptism and tempering of tribulation divine weapons. One could imagine that a tribulation divine weapon that could withstand the bombardment of tribulation divine weapons was not something ordinary materials could compare to. And this ice-fire mystic heart essence was a supreme material that could withstand the test of tribulation divine weapons. Tribulation divine weapon. Shintu Yuan's mind shook. He was completely lost. No wonder his tribulation divine weapon had no resistance in front of this sword embryo. How could his spiritual rune divine weapon be compared to the materials used to forge tribulation divine weapons? There was no comparison at all. What kind of monster have I left behind? Shintu Yuan roared in his heart. He recalled the scene where he had tried his best to persuade Yiguchen to stay. If he hadn't said so much back then, perhaps Yiguchen would have been pressured by the other smiths to leave. However, in the end, it was Shintu Yuan himself who suppressed the voices of protest and asked Yiguchen to stay. Could there be anything more ironic than this? When Shintu Yuan thought about it, he wanted to beat himself to death at that time. An unparalleled sense of regret exploded in Shintu Yuan's heart, causing him to spit out a mouthful of blood. However, it was a pity that no one was paying attention to Shintu Yuan, the loser. It's really the ice-fire mystic heart essence. Little friend, how did you know about this fusion method? Gongsun Xianlong lowered his stance completely and asked Yiguchen in a tone of asking for advice. I learned about it by accident, Yiguchen said lightly. He didn't want to reveal too much. Moreover, even if everyone here knew the secret of this fusion, they didn't have the heavenly sun mystic underworld fire and couldn't forge it for 200,000 times. Therefore, it was impossible to recreate the ice-fire mystic heart essence. I was rude. Gongsun Xianlong didn't mind at all and was extremely humble. Previously, he thought that Yiguchen would not turn back unless he hit a wall. Now that he thought about it, it was laughable. Even Gongsun Xianlong felt ashamed that he had been taught a lesson by a junior. Can you announce the result? Yiguchen said calmly. His only goal was to repair the tribulation divine weapon with the snow clay embryo. Of course, Gongsun Xiaoye said hesitantly. She glanced at Yiguchen from time to time and thought about how she looked at Yiguchen with disdain. She even wanted to tell him to leave. However, Yiguchen's behavior made her seem like a frog at the bottom of a well and short-sighted. Thinking of this, Gongsun Xiaoye couldn't help but blush. Her shrewish personality was also restrained. Even Gongsun Xianlong treated Yiguchen courteously. She didn't have the right to scold Yiguchen. At this time, Gongsun Xianlong said to Yiguchen seriously, little friend, as the head of the Gongsun family, I strongly invite you to join the Gongsun family. If you join, you will be a core member of the Gongsun family. Gongsun Xianlong really didn't want to give up on Yiguchen, such a good piece of jade. Hearing Gongsun Xuanlong's words, all the blacksmiths present revealed envious gazes. The Gongsun family was a super family and a blacksmith family with abundant resources. It could be said that almost all the blacksmiths present wanted to join the Gongsun family, but they didn't have the right. Little friend, if you join the Gongsun family, your future will be bright, the old blacksmith said with a sigh. Hearing this, Madame Xiao stood there in a daze, somewhat absent-minded. She couldn't believe that the lowly youth in her eyes had climbed up the social ladder and become a phoenix. His status had risen so quickly. Xiao Wanru's heart was filled with bitterness. A faint self-deprecating smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. She could only be a lowly concubine. If Yiguchen joined the Gongsun family and became a core member, his status wouldn't be lower than Shintu Miao's. His status as a blacksmith would be even more precious. I'm really stupid, but it's okay. In my heart, there's still someone. Whether it's young Master Yi or Shintu Miao, they're far from being comparable. The Sword Master. Xiao Wanru clutched her chest. She could only comfort herself with the image of the Sword Master in her heart. At least this young Master Yi in front of her was far from the Sword Master in her heart. Thinking of this, Xiao Wanru felt slightly better. Chapter 406. The Gongsun family was not only a super family, but also a family of blacksmiths. It could be said that the status of a blacksmith was even higher than that of an ordinary martial artist. In order to obtain a suitable divine weapon, many experts were willing to become a blacksmith's hired thug. Therefore, the Gongsun family's foundation was even deeper than the average super family. Being invited by the Gongsun family and becoming a core member was definitely an opportunity that other blacksmiths could only dream of. The rest of the blacksmiths looked at Yiguchen with envy in their eyes. Becoming a core member of the Gongsun family was like reaching the heavens in a single bound. However, Yiguchen's expression was incomparably calm in the face of this opportunity that others could not even dream of. I'm sorry. Thank you for your kind offer, family head Gongsun, but I have no such intention. Yiguchen cupped his fists. What? Hearing Yiguchen's words, all the blacksmiths doubted their ears. This young man with extraordinary talent in blacksmithing actually rejected the Gongsun family's invitation. Even Gongsun Xianlong had a faint look of astonishment on his face. Gongsun Xiaoya opened her eyes wide and looked at Yiguchen as if she was looking at an idiot. She couldn't help but ask, Hey, kid, do you know what kind of status the Gongsun family has in blacksmithing? Gongsun Xianlong glared at Gongsun Xiaoya, then turned to Yiguchen and said, Xiaoya, don't be rude to our young friend. My young friend, the Gongsun family is a family of blacksmiths. Given your amazing performance in blacksmithing, if you are trained by the Gongsun family, your future will be bright. It's not impossible for you to become a 4-star or even a 5-star blacksmith. Gongsun Xianlong said with a hint of passion in his voice. Gongsun Xianlong was unwilling to give up on a talent like Yiguchen. When the surrounding blacksmiths heard this, their hearts pounded rapidly. A 5-star blacksmith, it was rare to see such a person in the Saint Origin dynasty. And if they really did appear, then no matter if it was the royal family or the 7 great forces, they would have to treat them with respect, not daring to slight them in the slightest. Now, Gongsun Xianlong said that Yiguchen could become a 5-star blacksmith. How could this not be shocking? This little brother, just where did you come from? Xiao Lai's gaze was completely stunned. As for Madame Xiao and Xiao Wanru, their feelings were indescribable. On the other side, LV Qinghan's beautiful eyes revealed a strange light. She had never paid attention to Yiguchen before, because with her status, it was indeed difficult for Yiguchen to attract her attention. But now, even Gongsun Xianlong had made such a judgment. In LV Qinghan's heart, Yiguchen's position suddenly increased. A person with the potential to become a 5-star blacksmith was worth befriending. In the face of Gongsun Xuanlong's promise, Yiguchen's heart remained calm. Given his current situation, it was impossible for him to stay in the Gongsun family and learn forging in peace. Yiguchen pondered for a moment before replying, Thank you for your kindness, Patriarch, but to be honest, I am only interested in forging. I don't specialize in it. What do you mean, little friend? Gongsun Xianlong was momentarily stunned. What I mean is, I am not a blacksmith who specializes in forging. My main occupation is sword cultivation, and forging is just a hobby. Yiguchen had no choice but to speak the truth. This. Gongsun Xuanlong's eyes revealed a look of extreme shock. Not only him, but Gongsun Xiaoya and the other blacksmiths were also frozen in place, as if they had lost their souls. At first, no one thought highly of Yiguchen. Later, Yi Guqin's 200,000 refinements shocked everyone. Then, he fused the ice and fire mystic heart essence and cut Shintu Yuan's divine weapon in half. This made the blacksmith genius Gongsun Xiaoye speechless, and she could only admit defeat. But now, this young man actually said that forging was just a hobby, and not his main occupation. He was actually a sword cultivator who practiced the sword. Wah, you little brat, don't be so sarcastic. Gongsun Xiaoye was like an enraged tigress, baring her fangs and claws at Yi Guqin, as if she wanted to bite Yi Guqin. His words were really too hurtful. If Yi Guqin, who had such an amazing performance in forging, only treated forging as a hobby, how could these blacksmiths, who specialized in forging but still lost to Yi Guqin, accept this? At this moment, the other blacksmiths who participated in the competition were all short of breath, and lowered their heads in shame. Gongsun Xiaoye put her hands on her hips, panting with anger. As for Shintu Yuan, he was frozen in place, as if he had lost his soul. His body was like a piece of wood, and his heart was like dead ashes. His heart of forging had been completely shattered by Yi Guqin. This meant that it would be difficult for Shintu Yuan to improve in forging in the future. It was no wonder that Shintu Yuan was like this. Even Gongsun Xianlong was almost emotionally unstable. Gongsun Xianlong coughed dryly, and could only say, "Young friend's words are really straightforward. Since I have already won, can I choose a treasure material?" "I need a snow clay fetus," Yi Guqin said. "Yes, of course, I have it in my origin ring." Gongsun Xuanlong's origin ring flashed slightly, and a large snow clay fetus appeared. This snow clay fetus was like ice or snow, but its texture was soft, and it could merge with most metals to repair defects. "Many thanks." Yi Guqin kept the snow clay fetus in his origin ring. And he gave the sword fetus to Gongsun Xianlong. Gongsun Xiaoye grabbed it in her hands, and loved it so much that she could not bear to part with it. "Many thanks, young friend." Gongsun Xianlong could not suppress his joy. Even he did not expect that Yi Guqin would give him such a precious sword fetus of the Icefire Mystic Heart Essence. Yi Guqin did not care. He already had the Xianming Heavy Sword and the Blood Prison Sword, and did not need this sword fetus. He might as well give it to the Gongsun family and form a good relationship. Yi Guqin did not want to stay any longer, and was about to leave. But at this moment, LV Qinghan walked lightly and landed in front of Yi Guqin. Yi Guqin stopped in his tracks and looked at the person who had come. The woman in front of him was dressed in white, like a snow lotus, and there was a trace of classical beauty in her coldness. At the same time, the aura that was faintly emitted from her body made Yi Guqin frown slightly. The woman in front of him was a talented girl with extraordinary strength. "Young master, would you do me the honor of coming to House Yunyan? Qinghan would like to invite you to a banquet." LV Qinghan's tone was as calm as water. Yi Guqin's eyes were slightly surprised. The woman in front of him was the top genius of Consonance Palace, LV Qinghan, who was on par with the young war emperor and the others. "Hey, senior sister LV, although you're a senior sister, you can't poach him like this." Gongsun Xiaoye jumped over and said with her cheeks puffed up. It seemed that Yi Guqin was being fought over by the two beauties. Envy appeared in the eyes of all the surrounding men. Not everyone had the qualifications to enjoy such treatment. However, when this scene entered Xiao Wanru's eyes, she felt that it was extremely dazzling. "Wanru, don't mind him. As long as he doesn't join the Gongsun family, he won't be as good as you." Madame Xiao comforted her. But Xiao Wanru did not listen to Madame Xiao anymore. "I still have something to do, so let's forget about it. But I think we'll meet again soon." Yi Guqin looked deeply at LV Qinghan. LV Qinghan would naturally be present at the Seven Forces exchange, so they could indeed meet again. Yi Guqin cupped his fists and left the Gem Forge building alone. Chapter 407. Looking at Yi Guqin leaving alone, LV Qinghan fell into deep thought. She had a feeling that the young man in front of her was not as simple as a forging genius. As for the surrounding people, they were all shaking their heads. Facing LV Qinghan, who was a top-notch beauty, status, and ability, Yiguchen did not have the slightest intention of befriending her. This made people sigh. Seeing this, Xiao Wanru bit her lips slightly, and the bitterness in her eyes deepened. Mother, did you see that? You said that young master Yi did it to please me, but how does my status, and appearance compare to LV Qinghan's? Xiao Wanru clenched her fists tightly. Even Madame Xiao, who was best at talking, was speechless. She could not refute Xiao Wanru's words. In terms of appearance, Xiao Wanru was indeed beautiful, but was LV Qinghan inferior to her? In terms of status, Xiao Wanru was just a concubine of a great family's young master, while LV Qinghan was a top prodigy of the 7 major forces. It could be said that there was no comparison between the two. Yiguchen had casually rejected LV Qinghan's initiative to befriend him. Would he try to please Xiao Wanru? Oh madam, your prejudice against little brother is too deep. Xiao Lai also sighed deeply. Madame Xiao was embarrassed by her husband and daughter's words. However, she still could not swallow her pride and admit that she was wrong. Instead, she braced herself and said, so what? That boy is arrogant and unwilling to join the Gongsun family. His status will still be inferior to ours in the future. Madam, you are hopeless. Xiao Lai shook his head, completely disappointed in Madame Xiao. Xiao Wanru was silent, and her mood was gloomy. Their original purpose of coming here was to please Gongsun Xiaoye. However, now, even Madame Xiao did not have the face to please Gongsun Xiaoye. They left with their tails between their legs. On the other side, LV Qinghan's eyes flashed. We will meet again soon. What do you mean? She sighed slightly. Although LV Qinghan wanted to befriend him, if he was unwilling, she would not try to please him. Father, are we just going to let him go like this? Gongsun Xiaoye asked while playing with the sword embryo. Such a character shouldn't be a loner. I'm afraid he has some status. Fortunately, we're on good terms with him. It's also a form of good karma. Gongsun Xianlong sighed. He knew that a forcefully picked melon would not be sweet, and it was more likely that he would attract the other party's disgust. Sob. Father, I don't want to marry that idiot Shintu Miao anymore. Gongsun Xiaoye stammered. Nonsense. Gongsun Xianlong flung his sleeves and said. It's true. She said that if anyone wins against Xiao Yu will marry him. Gongsun Xiaoyu rolled her eyes. What Gongsun Xiaoye really liked were forging geniuses. Yiguchen was the only person in the younger generation who was better than her in blacksmithing. Although it was impossible for Gongsun Xiaoye to marry Yiguchen directly, she did have a deep curiosity about Yiguchen. When Gongsun Xianlong heard this, he shook his head and said, since that little friend hid his identity, I'm afraid his background is not that simple. It's fine to be friends with such a person, but it's impossible to entrust your life to him. If you know that kid's identity, will you agree to it? Gongsun Xiaoye asked mischievously. No. Little girl, you'd better marry Shintu Miao. Don't have any delusions. Gongsun Xianlong snorted coldly. Gongsun Xiaoye pouted, looking aggrieved. However, it was obvious that Gongsun Xiaoye would not give up so easily. After the blacksmith convention, the news about Yiguchen spread throughout northern Liang City at an astonishing speed. The blacksmith convention was only a competition organized by Gongsun Xiaoye. Logically speaking, it should not have caused much of a stir. However, Yiguchen's appearance made the blacksmith convention, which not many people knew about, known to almost everyone. In particular, Yiguchen had fused the Icefire Mystic Heart Essence, the forging material for the Heavenly Tribulation Divine Weapon. This alone was enough to cause a stir. After all, the Heavenly Tribulation Divine Weapon had never appeared in the Saint Origin dynasty. Now, even if only one of the materials for the Heavenly Tribulation Divine Weapon had appeared, it was enough to cause a stir. However, this was not the most important thing. What really caused a stir in northern Liang City was Gongsun Xuanlong's evaluation of Yi Guqin. He might become a 5-star blacksmith. Gongsun Xianlong was one of the most influential blacksmiths. Whether or not this was true, it meant that Yi Guqin's future achievements would not be low. Not to mention a 5-star blacksmith, even a 4-star blacksmith would be respected by powerhouses everywhere. It was this evaluation that made the blacksmith convention, which was originally a niche event, known to everyone. Even many disciples of the 7 great forces were discussing it. Hey, did you guys hear that a blacksmith genius appeared in the blacksmith convention? I heard that even Gongsun Xiaoya of the Gongsun family was defeated wholeheartedly. Do you think that the genius could be a hidden genius of the 7 great forces? I don't think so. Such a blacksmith genius can't be unknown. If he really becomes a 5-star blacksmith in the future, I'm afraid the 7 great forces will treat him like a living Buddha. The people of the various forces were discussing it. At this moment, Yi Guqin, who had caused quite a stir in northern Liang City and even became the topic of many people's conversation, rented a secluded courtyard with a forging room and began to repair the Blood Prison Sword and Heavenly Demon General Armor. The Blood Prison Sword and Heavenly Demon General Armor were both supreme-grade mystical inscription divine weapons, so it was not easy to repair them. Fortunately, the snow clay fetus had the ability to repair metals on its own, so it did not require much effort from Yi Guqin. He only needed some time. After using the snow clay fetus to repair these 2 divine weapons, although it's impossible to completely repair them, I should be able to use some spiritual inscription arrays to strengthen them. Yi Guqin looked at the divine weapons in front of him, took out the snow clay fetus, and began to repair and refine it. Just as Yi Guqin began to repair the divine weapons, on the other side, Xiao Wanru, who was temporarily staying in the inn, sneaked out when Madame Xiao and the others were not paying attention. She ran to the entrance of northern Liang City and found the smelly ditch where Madame Xiao had thrown away the jade slip. Wanru might have reaped what she sowed. Xiao Wanru bit her cherry lips so hard that blood seeped out slightly. Whether it was Shintu Miao's harsh words or the incident at the blacksmith convention, Xiao Wanru had completely lost her dignity. She felt like a laughable clown. Young Master Yi did not join the Gongsun family. Perhaps he can't help me escape the fate of being a concubine, but... Xiao Wanru made up her mind and jumped into the ditch to search for the jade slip that had been thrown away. She did not care that she was dirty all over. The stench from the mud made Xiao Wanru vomit incessantly. However, she only smiled miserably. She had reaped what she sowed. If she had not listened to Madame Zhao's advice at that time, she would not have humiliated herself like this now. After rummaging for a long time, Xiao Wanru finally found that dirty jade slip. She wiped the jade slip with her sleeve and put it inside her clothes. As far as Xiao Wanru was concerned, she would not use this jade slip. She did not want to implicate Yi Guqin in dealing with the Shintu family. If Yi Guqin had agreed to Gongsun Xuanlong's request at the blacksmith convention and become a core member of the Gongsun family, Xiao Wanru might have thought of using the jade slip. However, Yi Guqin had rejected it. Xiao Wanru did not know Yi Guqin's true identity, so when she saw that Yi Guqin had rejected joining the Gongsun family, she completely dismissed the idea of using the jade slip. Now, she only treated this jade slip as a comfort and something to rely on. Chapter 408. Northern Liang City. The storm caused by Yi Guqin at the blacksmith convention had yet to subside. Something even bigger was about to happen. That was the 7 great forces exchange. Now, the barbarian race had come in full force. They had breached the Great Wall and occupied 1/3 of the cities in the Great Desolation Prefecture. The barbarian race's attack this time was unprecedented. Therefore, during this period of time, the 7 great forces were also discussing and breaking in their strategies. However, the 7 great forces were entrenched in a complicated relationship, and they were inextricably linked to each other. It was impossible for them to completely cast aside their disloyalty and unite together sincerely. Therefore, the final plan was to divide the battle zones and deal with different barbarian tribes. Among the barbarians, there were strong and weak ones, and each of them had different fighting styles. For example, the Fire Tribe, the Thunder Tribe, and the other powerful barbarian tribes not only controlled many kinds of strange flames and thunders, but also had violent personalities. Those who fought against them would either die or be injured. On the other hand, the Blood Barbarian Tribe, Bone Barbarian Tribe, Soul Barbarian Tribe, and the others mostly cultivated some strange and evil techniques of the Barbarian Tribe. They were extremely cruel and bloodthirsty, so no force was willing to go against them. As for the Wood Tribe, the Water Tribe, and the other barbarian tribes, their attitudes were slightly gentler. Even the Wood Tribe was a barbarian tribe that favored peace and neutrality. They had always opposed war. Hence, when the 7 great forces fought against different berserker tribes, they would suffer different losses. Every time there was an exchange, the 7 major forces would send their geniuses to battle. The winner would have the right to choose his opponent first. In the previous social gatherings, the Limitless Sword Sect or the Sealed Saber Monarch Palace were the ones that obtained first place. As for the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest, most of them were in the middle and lower reaches. The reason was extremely simple. Because within the Sword Sect's forest of pagodas, only Yan Wushuang could truly be considered a top genius. Even Bai Zichen could only be considered half of it. Thus, in the end, the opponents of the Sword Faction's Tower Forest were mostly savage and ruthless berserkers, causing the Sword Faction's Tower Forest to suffer great losses. In the opinion of most people, the Sword Sect Tower Forest originally had the hope of obtaining first place this time. However, because of Yi Guqin's death, everyone felt that the result of the exchange wouldn't change at all, and the Sword Sect would still be at the bottom. The location of the exchange was a huge arena located in the center of northern Yang City. On all 4 sides of the fighting arena, there was a circular viewing platform. In the center was a pyramid-like trapezoidal building. On the pyramid, there were 7 distinct platforms from the highest to the lowest. They corresponded to the first place to the 7th place. At this moment, the fighting arena was already filled with people. Not only were there many martial arts experts from northern Yang City, but there were also some super families that came to show their support. A group of people walked out from the crowd, and the surrounding crowd automatically parted. At the same time, their eyes were filled with respect. So it's family head Gongsun. Greetings, clan leader Gongsun. This group of people was naturally from the Gongsun family. The middle-aged man in cloth robes leading them was none other than Gongsun Xianlong. As a family of blacksmiths, the Gongsun family's connections were even deeper than those of ordinary super families. On top of that, due to the fact that the Gongsun clan was in charge of forging divine weapons, even the 7 major powers treated the Gongsun clan with respect. Beside Gongsun Xianlong was a beautiful figure in red, causing the eyes of many people to light up. It was Gongsun Xiaoye, the little pepper of the Gongsun family. However, many people averted their gazes after glancing at him. This was because Gongsun Xiaoye was already taken. She was Shintu Miao's fiancée. However, their gazes were a little strange. This was because Gongsun Xiaoye, who was usually extremely shrewish and extroverted, was currently playing with the sword embryo that was overflowing with ice and fire. The surrounding spectators all knew that the young man who had forged the sword embryo was the only blacksmith genius who had surpassed Gongsun Xiaoye. Gongsun Xianlong shook his head helplessly when he saw Gongsun Xiaoye's distracted look. Ever since the blacksmith conference, this daughter of his had been constantly playing with the sword embryo, which made Gongsun Xianlong feel helpless. At one point, he even wanted to look for Yi Guqin. However, after the conference, Yi Guqin disappeared like smoke. Even though Gongsun Xianlong wanted to keep track of Yi Guqin, he still lost track of him. This girl is really obsessed. Gongsun Xianlong sighed. At this moment, another group of people walked over from the opposite side. The middle-aged man leading the group had a sturdy build. He was 70% similar to Shintu Miao. He was the current head of the Shintu family, Shintu Miao's father, Shintu Zhan. Beside him was Shintu Miao, who was carrying a tall saber on his back. His gaze was disdainful, with a ferocious aura. On the other side, Shintu Yuan was also following. However, his face was lifeless. Clearly, he had not walked out from the shadow of the blacksmith conference. Brother Xianlong, how have you been? Shintu Zhan looked at Gongsun Xianlong and smiled as he cupped his hands. Now, the entire northern Liang city knew that the Gongsun family and the Shintu family were going to have a marriage alliance. In the future, their prestige would be even greater. Brother Zhan, it's been a long time. Gongsun Xianlong also cupped his hands. However, the smile on his face was not that sincere. The world only knew that the Gongsun family and the Shintu family were going to have a marriage alliance. However, they did not know the deeper relationship between them. It was definitely not an ordinary marriage alliance. With the Gongsun family's heritage, there was no need for them to have a marriage alliance with the Shintu family. The reason was that the Shintu family had accidentally obtained a blacksmith's handbook. That handbook recorded the insights of a blacksmith master from the Nantian region. This kind of comprehension was definitely attractive to any blacksmith. Gongsun Xuanlong's father, the Gongsun family's old ancestor, Gongsun Yu, had been stuck at the pinnacle of 4-star, unable to break through to 5-star. As for the master's handbook that the Shintu family had obtained, it was extremely helpful for Gongsun Yu to break through to 5-star blacksmith. It was also because of this that the Shintu family had proposed a marriage alliance. After the two families became one, they would directly give the master's handbook to the Gongsun family as a betrothal gift. The pinnacle of 4-star and 5-star seemed to be only a thin line apart. However, the difference in status was like heaven and earth. A pinnacle of 4-star would be treated with great courtesy by the 7 major factions. However, if it was a 5-star, the 7 major factions would be willing to treat him as a guest of honor. It could be said that if Gongsun Yu broke through to 5-star, then the Gongsun family could become the 8th major faction outside of the 7 major factions. Therefore, Gongsun Yu had given the order to obtain the master's handbook no matter what. Compared to the revival of the family, what was Gongsun Xiaoya's happiness? After much consideration, no matter how much Gongsun Xianlong loved his daughter, he could only harden his heart and marry her off to the unwilling Shintu Miao. Shintu Zhan naturally saw the falsehood in Gongsun Xuanlong's smile. However, he did not care. As long as he had the master's handbook, he was not afraid that the Gongsun family would go back on their word. Chapter 409. Shintu Zhan looked at Gongsun Xiaoya and said with a smile, "Ha, my good daughter-in-law, the blacksmith convention that was held recently has spread throughout the entire northern Liang city. It's rare to have such a reputation at such a young age." Although the two families had yet to hold the wedding ceremony, Shintu Zhan had already addressed her as his daughter-in-law. However, what made Shintu Zhan unhappy was that Gongsun Xiaoya did not respond to him at all. Instead, she kept playing with the sword embryo. Humph. Shintu Zhan's face darkened. Seeing this, Gongsun Xianlong tugged at Gongsun Xiaoya's sleeves and said, "Xiaoya, don't be rude. Quickly reply. Seriously, how did that brat forge it?" "Damn it!" Gongsun Xiaoya muttered. She raised her head and glanced at the Shintu family. She said calmly, "Greetings, everyone." After that, she went back to playing with the sword embryo. Shintu Zhan snorted coldly. Although he was unhappy, he could not lower himself to argue with a girl. He looked at Gongsun Xianlong and said, "Brother Xianlong, the marriage between the two families is not something that my Shintu family forced upon your Gongsun family. It was ancestor Gongsun who strongly wanted the marriage between the two families, so." Shintu Zhan paused. His gaze was arrogant, and he did not continue. "Brother Zhan, you must be joking. My daughter is just a little naughty. The marriage is unshakable." Gongsun Xianlong could only smile apologetically. However, he suppressed the anger in his heart. To think that he was the head of a great family and a 4-star blacksmith master. Now, he had to lower his voice to Shintu Zhan. Looking at Shintu Zhan's arrogant attitude, Gongsun Xianlong wanted to slap him. However, when he recalled the warning of his father, Gongsun Yu, he suppressed his anger. Shintu Miao, who was standing beside Shintu Zhan, frowned slightly when he saw Gongsun Xiaoye. In the past few days, he had heard about the blacksmith convention from Shintu Zhan. However, what Shintu Miao cared about was Gongsun Xiaoye's attitude towards the youth called Qin. Xiaoye, is the sword embryo that pretty? Shintu Miao smiled and asked. He was cold and arrogant when facing Xiao Wanru and the others. However, he did not dare to look down on Gongsun Xiaoye. What does a layman like you know? Don't bother me. Gongsun Xiaoye said in annoyance as she stroked the sword embryo. Shintu Miao's expression turned slightly ugly as he was given the cold shoulder. Xiao Yu, you are my fiancé. Don't get involved with those shady people. Shintu Miao's tone turned cold. Scram. Gongsun Xiaoye spat out a single word. The blacksmithing genius that even she had to admit defeat and was unable to defeat had actually become a dubious person in Shintu Tong's words. Ha, it's normal for young couples to quarrel. Let's both take a step back. Shintu Zhan's tone was indifferent. Cousin, I think that cousin-in-law misses that youngster by the name of Qin. At this moment, Shintu Yuan quietly whispered into Shintu Miao's ear. Don't let me run into that kid, or else. Shintu Feng's face darkened when he heard this. And in Shintu Yuan's eyes, there was a trace of coldness, as if his scheme had succeeded. What he wanted to do was to incite hatred between Shintu Miao and Yi Guqin. He even wanted to borrow the power of the entire Shintu family to deal with Yi Guqin. This was because Shintu Yuan already hated Yi Guqin to the core. After the arrival of the Shintu and Gongsun families, many other families arrived. As for Xiao Wanru and the rest, they did not have the status and qualifications to watch the exchange. They could only hide in the inn and wait for Shintu Miao's wedding day after the exchange. Just as the crowd was anxiously waiting, the people from the 7 great factions finally appeared one after another. The first to appear was the Limitless Sword sect. A huge flying divine weapon that looked like a sword carried the people from the Limitless Sword sect over. The leader was a middle-aged man dressed in a black and white robe. His eyes were like the sun and moon in the sky, and he gave off an incomparably dignified and deep aura. It was the Sun Moon Hall Master of the Limitless Sword sect, Xian Tai. That's Hall Master Xian Tai. Yes, I heard that he has already broken through to become a divine dwelling expert. His strength is unfathomable. In the arena, many people's gazes fell on Xian Tai. Previously, Xian Tai had also appeared in the 10 prefectures elite gathering. At that time, he was only a half-step divine dwelling expert. However, he had now become a true divine dwelling expert. The prestige of the Limitless Sword sect had become even stronger. Behind Xian Tai, besides the various elders, were the elite disciples of the Sun Moon Hall. Xian Hao stood among them. His long black and white hair fluttered in the wind. He was cold and handsome, and looked down on everything. In addition, Xian Feng and Xian Dai, the twins known as the Black and White Impermanents, were also among them. Murong Ditian was also among the crowd. It could be said that the Sun Moon Hall's disciples were all elites. If you don't get first place this time, bear the consequences yourselves, Xian Tai warned coldly. Hee, rest assured, Hall Master. It's just a simple exchange, isn't it easy to get first place? Xian Dai giggled. She glanced at Xian Hao and said with deep meaning, fortunately, Yi Guqin of the Sword sect has died in the Void Sword realm. Otherwise, senior brother Xian Hao would be very nervous. Why talk about a dead person? Or do you want to test my bottom line like Yi Guqin? Xian Hao's eyes were cold. Alright, stop arguing. Let's wait for the exchange to begin. Xian Tai waved his hand. The group of people from the Limitless Sword sect landed on the highest level of the arena. Even super families like the Shintu and Gongsun families nodded at Xian Tai and the rest. Divine dwelling experts were what the super families lacked in terms of strength and foundation. Afterwards, people from the titled Saber King Palace also arrived. The person leading them was wearing a golden robe. He had a weathered face, and was the deputy palace master, Imperial Saber Yubufan. Is that Imperial Saber Yubufan? This is the first time I've seen him. I heard that 10 years ago, he and the Crimson Sword King, Feng Manlu, fought at the peak of the Forbidden Purple Mountain. It was a pity that I didn't have the chance to see them. Yubu Fan's arrival had once again raised a clamor. Just like Feng Manlu, Yubu Fan rarely appeared in front of the crowd after the battle at the Forbidden Purple Mountain. However, he was also a top expert of the Saint Origin dynasty. He was also known as a legend of the Saber Dao. Not only him, but his disciple, Gu Zun, was also famous in the Saint Origin dynasty. However, Gu Zun did not come to this exchange, which made many people feel that it was a pity. Feng Manlu, it's time for you to announce the news in this conference. Announce to the world that the promise of 10 years will be held at the summit of the Forbidden City. My successor has already been decided. Who is your successor? Yubu Fan's eyes were deep as he thought to himself. Behind him, demonic saber Leng Ju, fiendish saber Nya Ling, and blood saber Mo Juechen. Apart from Gu Zun, the three most famous saber kings of the titled Saber King Palace had all arrived. It was obvious that the titled Saber King Palace intended to take first place in this exchange. With the arrival of the Limitless Sword Sect and the titled Saber King Palace, the atmosphere became a little more solemn. After all, these factions were all led by divine-dwelling experts, a fact that made one feel a sense of respect. Just as the atmosphere became a little solemn, a jade-white flying boat flew over. It carried a group of beautiful women. They were the female disciples of the Consonant's Divine Palace. Chapter 410. The leader of the white flying boat was an old woman. Although she was old, her skin was still glossy, but her expression was cold. She was clearly not in a good mood. The old woman was the vice palace master of Consonant's Palace and was also a divine-dwelling expert. Beside her were several beautiful middle-aged women and elders, LV Qinghan, Zither Fairy and other core female disciples of Sky Immortal Palace. I didn't expect Grandma Shichuan to be the leader of Consonant's Palace. But why does she look so bad? Don't you know? I heard that Pan Shuoyan, who died at the hands of the Sword Sect, was one of Grandma Shichuan's disciples. Her disciple has already died at the Heaven Pride's gathering. How can she be in a good mood? Some people who knew a little bit about the situation whispered. Grandma Shichuan's expression froze. She glanced at Zither Fairy, causing Zither Fairy's heart to sink. Zither Fairy, you colluded with outsiders to deal with a disciple of the palace. If not for the palace master's order to protect you, I would have made you pay a price. Grandma Shichuan did not have a good impression of Zither Fairy. This disciple was wrong. Zither Fairy bit her red lips and lowered her head. Whether it was inside or outside Consonant's Palace. Every time, the one who provoked and threatened her was Pan Shuoyan. Zither Fairy had always been the one who tolerated. However, Grandma Shichuan turned a blind eye to this. She only believed that Zither Fairy had colluded with Yi Guqin to harm Pan Shuoyan. As for Pan Shuoyan colluding with Fang Chen, Ji Yan, and the others, she did not mention a single word. Grandma Shichuan, the exchange is near. Let's focus on the present. LV Qinghan stepped forward and stood in front of Zither Fairy. Since Qinghan has interceded for you, then forget it. Fortunately, the culprit, Yi Guqin, is already dead. Otherwise, I would have made him kneel in front of Shuoyan's cenotaph and kowtow to repent. Grandma Shichuan said in an unfriendly tone. Pan Shuoyan had been dismembered by Yi Guqin. She had died a miserable death and not even a complete corpse was left behind. In the end, she could only erect a cenotaph in Consonant's Palace. Zither Fairy's face paled when she heard this because she had poked her sore spot. LV Qinghan also sighed. She didn't know when her junior sister would be able to walk out of the negative influence of Yi Guqin. Following the arrival of the group of eye-catching female disciples from the Consonant's Divine Palace, the originally solemn atmosphere in the entire battle arena relaxed a little. At this moment, another group of people arrived on a flying boat. The people from the 3 imperial palaces have arrived. Someone recognized him with a single glance. He was a robust man with long, fiery red hair. His eyes were the same as the dead Ji Yan's. They were crimson like crystals, and it was as if flames were about to spurt out from his eyes. That must be one of the 3 emperors of the 3 imperial palaces, the Yan Emperor. Some people looked at the red-haired man and thought. The reason why the 3 imperial palaces were called that was because they had 3 emperors, all of whom were divine-dwelling experts. The Yan Emperor was one of them. Each of the 3 rulers had a true disciple. The true disciple of the Flame Emperor was Ji Yan, who had died at the hands of Yi Guqin. However, it seems like the Yan Emperor's mood isn't any better than Grandma Shichuan's. Some people who were watching the show thought. At this moment, the Yan Emperor's expression was even colder than Grandma Shichuan's. This was because Pan Shuoyan was at most one of Grandma Shichuan's disciples. Ji Yan, on the other hand, was the only true disciple of the Yan Emperor. His status was special. How could the Yan Emperor be in a good mood when his only true disciple had died? How hateful. Why did Yi Guqin die? It would have been great if he was still alive. Then, I would have let him have a taste of death 10 times more painful than my disciples. The Yan Emperor's voice was cold and filled with hatred. Senior Yan Emperor, why are you sulking over a dead person? Zhou Tong, who was dressed in white, comforted the Yan Emperor. I'm afraid that Yang Haotsang won't be able to come on time. You must achieve a good result in this exchange. Don't embarrass the old Ling Emperor. The Yan Emperor's tone softened. Yang Haotsang was the name of the Little War Emperor. Senior Yan Emperor, don't worry. I'll leave for a while. Zhou Tong cupped his hands and flew towards the Consonance Palace. Wow, it's Zhou Tong. Is he the true disciple of the 3 imperial palaces' Ling Emperor? He's so handsome. I heard that his character are impeccable. Some of the female disciples of the Consonance Palace were infatuated. Among them, there was a beautiful lady in a flowery dress who came forward. She was the same as Pan Shuoyan, a disciple of Grandma Shichuan. Her name was Rintingting. She was elegant and beautiful. She could be considered a rare beauty. At the same time, her cultivation was at the 9 transformation divine soul realm. Although her strength was slightly weaker than LV Qinghan's, it wasn't too far off. Young Master Zhou, are you here to look for Tingting? Ren Tingting came forward and asked shyly. She had met Zhou Tong a few times before. No matter how shrewd Zhou Tong was, in the eyes of outsiders, his appearance, strength, status, and character were all perfect. It was no wonder that even a prideful lady like Ren Tingting was infatuated with him. The person I'm looking for is Zither Fairy. Zhou Tong moved past Ren Tingting and arrived in front of LV Qinghan and Zither Fairy. Ren Tingting's expression froze. She turned her beautiful eyes to Zither Fairy with deep jealousy in them. She was unwilling to give up and also came to their side. I'll definitely get into the top 3 in this exchange. When it's over, I hope junior sister will give me face and come to House Yunyan for a gathering. Zhou Tong's tone was gentle and affectionate. Ren Tingting's heart was filled with jealousy. Zither Fairy wanted to refuse, but LV Qinghan said with a faint smile, sure, but it depends on your performance. Ha, of course. Senior sister will also give me face. Zhou Tong smiled. Well, young Master Zhou, Ren Tingting's face was slightly embarrassed. Sorry, this is a small private gathering of mine. Zhou Tong tactfully declined. After the exchange, Zhou Tong made up his mind to thoroughly win over Zither Fairy's heart. He had already told LV Qinghan that LV Qinghan would take the opportunity to leave, leaving only him and Zither Fairy. Regardless of whether Zither Fairy accepted him or not, Zhou Tong had his own methods to take her virginity. How could he casually let an outsider join his plan? However, Ren Tingting didn't know this, and the jealousy in her heart only grew stronger. She couldn't help but say, although young Master Zhou has good intentions, junior sister Qin doesn't seem to appreciate it. Right now, her mind is only filled with that bastard sword sect that killed junior sister Xuoyan. What did you say? Shut up. Zither Fairy's face was filled with anger. It was fine for her to be wronged, but Ren Tingting's words about the bastard sword sect was intolerable. What? Didn't I say that you colluded with that shameless sword sect and plotted against junior sister Xuoyan? It's a pity that such a good girl was schemed against by a pair of dogs like you. Truly pitiful. Ren Tingting deliberately spoke in a loud voice, attracting the attention of the surrounding people. Grandma Shichun glanced at her, then ignored her. In her heart, she thought that it was fine to let Ren Tingting teach Zither Fairy a lesson. Zither Fairy was so angry that blood rushed to her head, and a trace of blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. It was clearly Pan Xuelian's vicious heart that schemed against them. But now, Ren Tingting was saying that it was Zither Fairy and Yi Guqin's fault. Zither Fairy was so angry that her delicate body trembled, and her face turned pale. Ren Tingting's heart was filled with joy, and she wanted to laugh out loud. At the same time, she saw Zhou Tong's slightly gloomy face. She was even more pleased with herself. Ren Tingting had done this on purpose to let Zhou Tong see that Zither Fairy only had Yi Guqin in her heart, and not Zhou Tong. This way, Ren Tingting would have a chance to interfere. Her scheming was exactly the same as Pan Xuelian's. Chapter 411. Seeing that Ren Tingting had insulted Yi Guqin, the Zither Fairy's face turned pale and blood flowed from the corners of her mouth. Zhou Tong's heart turned cold. Zhou Tong's heart surged with coldness. Although he had heard of Yi Guqin's achievements, he had never met him. Therefore, he did not think that Yi Guqin was better than him. This was because many things would become more and more exaggerated after being spread. This was also the source of Zhou Tong's dislike of Yi Guqin. However, he was quite scheming and did not show it on his face. Instead, he said to Ren Tingting, "Miss, how can you say that about Yi Guqin of the sword sect? I believe that he is a heaven pride worthy of respect." With these words, the Zither Fairy looked at Zhou Tong and unconsciously became more pleasing to the eye. She actually revealed a slight smile and said, "Many thanks, young Master Zhou." "It's nothing." Zhou Tong smiled. "Young Master Zhou, you've been deceived. That shameless sword sect is ruthless and vicious. They can't be compared to even 1/10,000th of you." Ren Tingting hurriedly flattered, afraid that Zhou Tong would dislike her. "Miss, please don't say any more." Zhou Tong's face was like this, but there was an extremely faint smile at the corners of his mouth. So what if he was a sword sect? So what if he was powerful? He still ended up being slandered after his death. Zhou Tong sneered in his heart. "If you only know how to use force, you are nothing more than a boorish man. In the end, you will only end up like Yi Guqin, dead. Only by using both intelligence and force can you be like me and obtain all the fame and status." Zhou Tong fanned himself. He was already thinking about his plan for House Yunyan after the exchange. At this moment, another group arrived in the distance. The leader was an old man in azure robes. He was the deputy sect master of the Nine Profound sect, Qing Yang. Behind him were several people who had some relationship with Yi Guqin, such as Chen Yi and Bai Yanji. Afterwards, people from the Saint Origin Academy also arrived. The leader was a divine-dwelling expert from the Saint Origin Empire, Hun Tianho. Behind him was a group of heaven prides and elites from the Saint Origin Academy. Fang Chen, who had participated in the Void Sword Realm, was also among them. As for Prince Yuani, he was nowhere to be seen. Although Fang Chen had saved Prince Yuani in the Void Sword Realm, his injuries were too severe. He was still recuperating and would not be able to get out of bed for a few months. Compared to Fang Chen, the most dazzling people from Xingyuan Academy were the other two. The young man in blood-red armor was also a young marquis named Mo Lengia. There was also a young girl wearing a golden robe, looking extraordinarily luxurious and exuding a noble aura. Like Prince Yuan Yi, she was born from the empress and was doted on by the primitive emperor. She was called Princess Yuan Shi. Fang Chen, is that Yi Guqin really that powerful? How could he injure royal brother like that? Princess Yuan Shi raised her delicate palm, which was smeared with expensive perfume. Your Highness, that is indeed the case. Fang Chen's eyes were still filled with fear. It was because he would never forget the destructive thunder tide caused by the collision of the strange thunder. Ha, Fang Chen, you are really regressing the more you cultivate. As the young marquis, you are afraid of this and that. If it were me, even if Yi Guqin appeared in front of me right now, I would be able to suppress him directly. Mo Langia snorted disdainfully. It's easy for you to say that. If you had experienced the Void Sword Realm, I'm afraid you wouldn't say that, Fang Chen retorted. Humph, don't try to scare me with the story of killing 100 people with one strike. Don't you know that it's just a rumor? Who would believe it? Is that sword master a divine palace expert? Mo Langia shook his head. To be honest, I don't believe it either. But no matter what, sword master is dead. I wanted to avenge royal brother with my own hands, Princess Yuan she said casually. It was as if sword master was just a small character to her that she could deal with easily. Alas, the ignorant are fearless. Fang Chen sighed inwardly and did not say anything more. One would never know without witnessing it with their own eyes. How terrifying was Sword Master, who had emerged from the Azura Blood Sea. As time passed, 6 of the 7 major forces had arrived. Only the Sword Sect's Tower Forest was left. Whispers could be heard throughout the entire martial arts arena. Humph, it's such an important exchange, but Sword Sect Talon doesn't care about it at all. They're just a bunch of mobs. Xian Tai snorted coldly, his voice echoing throughout the arena. Everyone in the arena was not surprised by Xian Tai's mocking words. The Limitless Sword Sect and Sword Sect Talon had an irreconcilable enmity. It was normal for Xian Tai to have such an attitude. Yes, that's true. Sword Sect Talon doesn't care about the barbarian race at all. It's a disgrace for such an irresponsible force to stand side by side with us, the Flame Emperor said unhappily. Oh. Many people were surprised by the Flame Emperor's words. The 3 imperial palaces and Sword Sect Talon did not have any great enmity. Sword Sect Talon has gone overboard, Grandmother Shichuan of Consonant's Divine Palace said indifferently. Sword Sect Talon should be taught a lesson, Hun Tianho said coldly. Hua. The arena was in an uproar. The divine dwelling experts of 4 of the 7 great forces had spoken one after another, expressing their hostility towards Sword Sect Talon. Everyone knew about the enmity between the Limitless Sword Sect and Sword Sect Talon, but the other great forces did not have any great enmity with them. Could it be because of the Void Sword domain? Some people immediately thought. Apart from Sword Sect Talon, 9 Profound Sect, and some disciples of Consonant's Divine Palace, the Void Sword domain had suffered heavy casualties. The other great forces had suffered heavy losses. It was normal for them to be hostile towards Sword Sect Talon because of this. After all, those who had died were elite disciples who would become pillars in the future. As for the 9 Profound Sect, they had a good relationship with Sword Sect Talon, so Vice Sect Master Qing Yang naturally would not say anything. What surprised everyone was that the saber-conferred king did not say anything. Yu Bufan's face was calm, but a complicated look flashed in his eyes. Although he and Feng Manlu were fated rivals, they still appreciated each other's talents. Thus, at this moment, Yu Bufan maintained his silence and did not say anything. It was at this moment that Sword Sect Talon's group finally arrived. The leader of the group was a handsome man in plain clothes. He was none other than Feng Manlu. It's the Lightless Sword King, Feng Manlu. He's the one leading the group this time. I thought it would be the Great Elder. Feng Manlu's arrival caused quite a commotion. After all, he was once a famous Sword King in the Saint Origin dynasty. After going into seclusion, he rarely appeared in front of the public. The last time he appeared was in the Tianhuang Plains. You're really here. Yu Bufan's gaze instantly fell on Feng Manlu. Although Feng Manlu was blind, he could also feel Yu Bufan's gaze. 10 years ago, after the battle at the Forbidden City Summit, the two had rarely seen each other and had never fought. This time, whether it was Feng Manlu or Yu Bufan, they both knew in their hearts. After the exchange, it was time for them to announce the identity of the successor of the Forbidden City's Battle of the Summit. Yu Bufan's successor was undoubtedly the Saber Maniac Prime Sovereign. What Yu Bufan was curious about was who Feng Manlu would choose to be his successor after Sword Sect Master's death. Chapter 412. The arrival of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest did not ease the atmosphere in the arena. Instead, it made the atmosphere even more treacherous. However, Feng Manlu did not seem to notice as he led the elders and disciples of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest to the spectator stand. Behind Feng Manlu were Yan Wushuang, Bai Zichen, Wang Xiaotian, Ji Ling, Chu Qingqi, Yi Xia, Yuan Mia, and the others. However, Chu Qingqi, Yi Xia, Ji Ling, and the others all had a trace of anxiety in their eyes. The outside world thought that Yi Guchen was dead, but they all knew that Yi Guchen was actually still alive. Not only was he alive, but his strength was also far greater than before. He was almost the strongest among the younger generation of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest. Previously, there was news from the sect that Brother Yi had already left the pagoda. Why didn't he come here in time? Chu Qingqi lowered his voice and asked. If Brother Yi can't make it in time, it'll be bad. I'm afraid I can't do anything by myself. Ji Ling's beautiful eyes were filled with worry. Although they were not weak, those who could really rank among the top in the exchange were the top geniuses such as Xian Hao, Zhou Tong, LV Qinghan, Demonic Blade Ling Ju, and the others. Ji Ling, Wang Xiaotian, and the others were slightly weaker. Even Bai Zichen could barely do it. The reason why the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest was the last to arrive was because they wanted to wait for Yi Guchen. However, Yi Guchen did not appear, which made the group of inner court disciples slightly disappointed. Even Elder Qing He and the other elders were frowning. If they ranked last again in this exchange, it was very likely that they would be selected to fight against the Fire Tribe, Thunder Tribe, and other powerful barbarian tribes. At that time, there would be heavy casualties. This was what the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest wanted to see the most. Is Yi Guchen avoiding the battle because he's afraid? Wang Xiaotian said casually. He was met with the stern gazes of many inner court disciples and even a few elders. I was just saying. Wang Xiaotian was sweating from the stairs. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Back then, his reputation in the inner court wasn't inferior to Yi Guchen's in the slightest. But now, his casual questioning of Yi Guchen was met with a wave of objections. This obviously showed exactly how great Yi Guchen's reputation in the inner court was. Bai Zichen, who was silently watching from the side, clenched his fists tightly. A strong sense of unwillingness surged in his heart. Bai Zichen, who had once been second only to Yan Wushuang, was now like an outsider in the inner court. No one cared about him at all. Yi Guchen, you mustn't come. At this exchange, I, Bai Zichen, will do my best to turn the tides. Bai Zichen swore in his heart. As long as he performed amazingly in this exchange, his reputation in the inner court would definitely rise again. Even Yan Wushuang might change her opinion of him. At this moment, Yan Wushuang saw that the surrounding disciples of the inner yard were all lifeless. Her gaze was incomparably complicated. Before Yi Guchen came to the Sword Sect's Pagoda Forest, she was the goal and faith of all the disciples of the inner yard. As long as Yan Wushuang was around, the disciples of the inner yard would be filled with confidence. But now, only Yi Guchen didn't come. Most of the disciples of the inner yard looked as if they had lost their backbone and were in low spirits. Yi Guchen, Yan Wushuang, won't admit defeat. Yan Wushuang bit her lips slightly. She had indeed lost to Yiguchen and lost the opportunity to become the successor of Wind's sweeping pavilion. However, she didn't want to lose to Yiguchen forever. And this exchange was the best opportunity for Yan Wushuang to perform. Like Bai Zichen, she wanted to rely on herself to turn the tides and rebuild her reputation. Wind's sweeping pavilion, your sword sex pagoda forest is really arrogant, Xian Tai said coldly. I feel that the sword sex pagoda forest's attitude isn't right. Why don't we just let them be the last? Yan Emperor said with a vengeful tone. In his eyes, although Yiguchen was dead, the hatred in his heart couldn't be resolved. Therefore, he vented his anger on the sword sex pagoda forest. I agree, Grandma Shichuan echoed. These words caused an uproar in the entire martial arts arena. If that was the case, the sword sex pagoda forest wouldn't need to participate in the competition. They could just wait for the results. In the face of the sharp words of the divine dwelling experts, Feng Manlu's expression remained as calm as water. Everyone, let's take a step back and start the exchange, Feng Manlu said. Feng Manlu, what kind of attitude is this? How dare a spirit bridge expert speak to us divine dwelling experts in such a tone? Hun Tianho said coldly. The Saint Origin Academy had also suffered heavy losses in the Void Sword realm. Feng Manlu clasped his hands behind his back, his originally gentle expression slowly receding. Although he was dressed simply, his aura was as unfathomable as the ocean. In my opinion, the divine dwelling stage is just so. His words caused the entire noisy martial arts arena to instantly fall into a frozen deathly silence. The divine dwelling stage is just so. Oh, Feng Manlu, it seems that you still have a lot of complaints after falling from the divine dwelling stage. Xian Tai laughed loudly as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. He wasn't the only one. The Flame Emperor, Grandma Shichuan, Hun Tianho, and the other divine dwelling experts also laughed. They weren't angry. They only felt that it was ridiculous. There were only 2 divine dwelling experts present who didn't laugh. One was Sect Master Qing Yang of the 9 Profound Sect, and the other was Yu Bufan. He and Feng Manlu were the most familiar opponents. Yu Bufan also knew that Feng Manlu never boasted. Forget it. Let's start the exchange. Don't let the younger generation wait, said Sect Master Qing Yang. Let's start, said Yu Bufan. I'll let it go this time out of respect for Sect Master Qing Yang and Hall Master Yu. Feng Manlu, watch your words and actions in the future. Xian Tai flicked his sleeve and spoke as if he was instructing the younger generation. He knew that he was strong enough to crush Feng Manlu after breaking through to the divine dwelling stage. Damn it! The group of Inner Academy disciples were incomparably furious. Forget it. Let's start. Feng Manlu was gentle and didn't care. With the gathering of the 7 great forces, the exchange officially began. Each great force would send out their top disciples. This was because this exchange would decide who the 7 major forces would be facing. None of the forces wanted to suffer heavy losses. Therefore, they all wanted to be the champion and obtain the right to choose their battle zone. Even if they couldn't be the champion, they didn't want to be the last. This was because the last place was destined to face the Fire Clan, the Lightning Clan and the other powerful barbarian clans. Disciples of the great forces, enter the arena, said an old man who was in charge of the exchange. Some people from the 7 great forces entered the arena, but there weren't many of them. This was because a top heaven pride could defeat more than 10 ordinary geniuses. Therefore, the number of people was meaningless. Only strength was meaningful. Go, said Feng Manlu indifferently. Yan Wushuang, Bai Zichen, Wang Xiaotian, Ji Ling, and Yuan Mie stood up. Other than Yiguchen, Yan Wushuang and the others were ranked the highest. Yuan Mie had also entered the top 10 in the inner courtyard ranking battle. Moreover, he possessed darkness sword intent and was stronger than ordinary heaven prides. Therefore, he also had to participate. Looking at the 5 people who stood up and walked to the center of the arena, the other inner courtyard disciples broke out in cold sweat. Would they still be able to win without Yi Guqin? Chapter 4:13. The chosen disciples of the seven forces walked to the center of the arena. The pyramid-shaped trapezoidal building was the focus of everyone's attention. The entire building, from top to bottom, had a total of 7 distinct platforms. The only thing the top prodigies of the seven forces needed to do was to occupy the platforms they were on and challenge the top at the same time. There were no one-on-one rules in such a competition. They could attack together or individually. However, the top prodigies who could participate in the exchange were all proud and arrogant people. How could they team up with others? Hence, most of the time, it was one-on-one. This was also a competition between the prodigies of the various sections. Everyone, I'm sure most of you know the rules of the exchange. There are 7 platforms from the top to the bottom of the pyramid. In the end, whichever force's disciple can occupy the platform at the top of the pyramid will be the first, followed by the second and third. The elder in charge of the competition explained. The showdown between the prodigies of the 7 forces officially begins. Following the elder's shout, the entire arena was instantly stirred up by a storm. It was a storm caused by the true qi of the various forces' disciples. I, Xian Hao, will take the first place. Xian Hao put his hands behind his back and took a step forward. His figure flashed out instantly. I, Zhou Tong, will definitely be in the top 3 this time. Zhou Tong was dressed in white and held a folding fan in his hand. It's a pity that Yi Guqin is dead. My saber can't find an opponent. Leng Zhu held the demonic saber in his hand. His gaze was cold as he shook his head and sighed. The top prodigies of the various forces all shot towards the top of the pyramid like arrows leaving the bow. No one was willing to give up the first place right from the start. Hence, at this moment, the prodigies of the 7 forces were all aiming for the first place at the top of the pyramid. Boom! Li Hao, we haven't decided who won the other day. Let's fight again today. Feng Ping, I'll avenge my previous humiliation at this exchange. Soon, the prodigies of the 7 forces were engaged in a chaotic battle. The 7 forces had complicated relationships with each other and were entangled with grudges. There was naturally a lot of friction between them. This exchange, which was the focus of everyone's attention, was the best platform to settle their grudges. Although there was a rule in the exchange meeting that forbade anyone from killing them, Yi Zichen didn't want to kill them. However, the feeling of being able to defeat their enemies and trample them beneath their feet, and being the focus of everyone's attention, still made every single one of the geniuses unleash their full strength and unleash their brilliance. I, Yan Wushuang, aim to come first. No one can stop me. Yan Wushuang held a sword in her hand and wore an ice silk skirt armor. Her phoenix brows were raised, and her delicate and pretty face carried a valiant and heroic bearing. Yan Wushuang, who had comprehended the wind sword essence, had also left her name on the sword seeking steel. She was a top genius of the sword sect Pagoda Forest. Although she had lost to Yi Guqin in a single strike, it did not mean that she was weak. It was because Yi Guqin was too strong. Besides that, the pathos of the heavens had shaken Yan Wushuang's mind, and that was why she'd lost. Therefore, Yan Wushuang's strength was actually not weak. Yan Wushuang, you had better stay behind. The first place is destined to be our limitless sword sect. The 2 elite sky prides of the Sun Moon Hall from the limitless sword sect stepped forward to stop Yan Wushuang. You can't stop me. Yan Wushuang's eyes were cold. Although the 2 sky prides of the Sun Moon Hall were strong, they were no match for her. What if we join in? 3 figures suddenly appeared. 2 men and 1 woman. They were Princess Yuan Shi from the Saint Origin Academy and the 2 young marquises, Mo Lengjia and Fang Chen. The sword sect Pagoda Forest has no enmity with you. What do you want? Yan Wushuang frowned slightly. The competition between geniuses in the exchange was a free-for-all. In addition, the 7 major forces had a complicated relationship. In the past, There had never been a situation where multiple forces joined forces to deal with one force. But now, after the disciples of the Limitless Sword sect had stepped forward to stop them, the people of the Saint Origin Academy had also stepped forward. No enmity. Ha, who did this to my brother, who is still lying on the bed with serious injuries? Princess Yuan, she raised her sharp chin and said coldly. He reaped what he sowed. Yan Wushuang was not afraid of Princess Yuan Shi at all. You. Humph, this is only secondary. After all, Yi Guqin is already dead. The one I want to teach is this bastard a lesson. Princess Yuan, she said as she looked at Yuan Mie. Yuan Mie was the most special one among the primitive emperor's sons. Yuan Mie, as a prince of the dynasty, you betrayed us by joining the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest. You are a disgrace to our dynasty, Mo Lengia said disdainfully, wearing blood-red armor and holding a blood-red spear. You guys go. Leave this to me, Yuan Mie said indifferently to Yan Wushuang and the others. Then, he took out his dermic pattern divine weapon, Silent Night. At the same time, a ghastly and gloomy sword concept that was silent into the night silently spread out. Seeing this, the eyes of Princess Yuan Shi and the others turned solemn. Yuan Mie, who had comprehended the dark sword intent, was not to be underestimated. How can you handle 3 people at the same time by yourself? Ji Ling and the others were surprised. This competition is not that simple. Yuan Mie's voice was hoarse. Without saying anything else, he attacked Princess Yuan Shi and the others with his sword. Hearing this, Yan Wushuang's face suddenly turned serious. She looked around and realized that, although most of the Sky Prides were fighting with each other, there were still some forces who had not moved. They looked at Yan Wushuang and the others with cold eyes. Finally, the 3 blades appeared in the sealed saber royal palace. The leader was a black-clothed youth, holding a demonic saber with demonic patterns surrounding it. His eyes were as cold as ice. Although Ling Ju's goal was to be number 1, he had a grudge to settle before that. Yan Wushuang's face turned serious. Even she could not ignore Ling Ju, the leader of the 3 blades. In the Void Sword realm, Yi Guqin killed hundreds of people with one strike. Although I don't believe it, the lives of the disciples on the Sky Saber list will be on your heads, Ling Ju said in a low voice. Although I can't kill you in this competition, I can injure you severely so that you won't be able to be number 1, Nia Ling said with a trace of hatred. Back in the Void Sword realm, he and Mo Juechen had been humiliated by Yi Guqin. Now that he had the chance, he naturally wanted to get back at them. Limitless Sword Sect, Saint Origin Academy, Sealed Saber Royal Palace. The Sky Prides of the 3 forces were all against the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest. This scene caused all the spectators around the fighting arena to be stunned for a moment. This kind of situation had never happened before. Why are the disciples of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest surrounded? Is it the revenge of the other forces for what happened in the Void Sword realm? Many people guessed. In the Void Sword realm, Yi Guqin had not only killed hundreds of people with one strike, but he had also killed hundreds of disciples from the various forces with the collision of the strange lightning bolts. In everyone's eyes, Yi Guqin was already dead. However, the other forces would not let this go so easily. Chapter 4:14. This is too shameless. Elder Qing, he was so angry that his face turned red. The other elders, such as Gu Tuo and Shi Yun, also had ugly expressions on their faces. They had never thought that the Limitless Sword sect and the other powers would actually do such a thing. Although this action was somewhat shameful, it did not violate the rules of the exchange. Xian Tai, Hun Tianho, and the other Divine Palace experts looked at each other and smiled. Yu Bufan shook his head slightly. He did not ask Ling Ju and the others to join forces against the Sword Sect's Tower Forest. Lord Feng Manlu, what should we do? Elder Qing, he was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. If this continued, then their Sword Sect Pagoda Forest would probably be ranked at the bottom again in this exchange. Feng Manlu did not say anything. He believed that the successor he had his eyes on would not disappoint him. In the arena, Yan Wushuang and the others were surrounded by the crowd. If you withdraw now, you can avoid physical pain, Ling Ju said as he stroked his devil saber. The disciples of the Sword Sect's Tower Forest can only die standing, not live kneeling. You want us to flee without a fight? Dream on. Yan Wushuang pointed her sword at the sky like a goddess of war. Her true qi erupted, and the wind sword intent whistled out. Boom! There was no superfluous words. Yan Wushuang and the others were determined to take first place. As for the people from the other forces, they wanted revenge. There was no way to reconcile the two. Ling Ju directly attacked. His devil saber slashed through the air, bringing with it a pitch-black saber light. Yan Wushuang's sword swept out, and the sword light whistled like a gust of wind. Their saber light and sword energy collided, and violent ripples erupted. In addition, Nia Ling, Mo Juechen, and the prodigies of the Limitless Sword Sect's Sun Moon Hall also attacked. Bai Zichen, Wang Xiaotian, and Ji Ling also attacked. Although the three of them were the top prodigies of the inner court, their opponents were the prodigies of the other forces. Nia Ling and Mo Juechen's cultivation were similar to theirs, and the prodigies of the Sun Moon Hall were not weak either. As for Xian Hao and the Black and White Impermanence, they directly rushed toward the first-place seat. When Chen Yi and the others of the 9 profound sects saw this, they wanted to help. However, the white-clothed Zhou Tong had a smile on his face as he indifferently blocked their path. Little Spirit Emperor, what are you doing? Chen Yi and Bai Yanji both frowned. Let them handle their matters. We should focus on the exchange, shouldn't we? Zhou Tong said lightly with a smile on his face. With his scheming, it was naturally impossible for him to personally deal with the Sword Sect's Talon. That would cause Zither Fairy's disgust. However, Zhou Tong was absolutely unwilling for others to help the Sword Sect's Tower Forest. Thus, he stopped Chen Yi and the others. As one of the 3 little emperors, although Zhou Tong was good at scheming, his strength was not weak. This caused Chen Yi and the others to be unable to reinforce the Sword Sect's Tower Forest in time. On the other side, Zither Fairy also wanted to help, but she was stopped by Ren Tingting. Please step aside. The Zither Fairy took out her jade zither. This was the Dermot pattern divine weapon that Ying Ning had given her. I won't step aside. What can you do to me? Oh right, I forgot to tell you that my master told me to teach you a lesson if possible. Consider it as payback for senior sister Pan. Ren Tingting's gaze was like a cat playing with a mouse. Her master was naturally Grandma Shichuan. Ren Tingting had been worried about not finding an opportunity to deal with Zither Fairy. Now that she had seized the opportunity, she would not miss it. Not far away, LV Qinghan frowned slightly. She wanted to step forward to stop them, but she was stopped by the other 2 prides of Consonance Palace. Senior Sister LV, this is Grandma Shichuan's intention. Don't make things difficult for us. The 2 prides said coldly. Grandma Shichuan. LV Qinghan clenched her jade-like hands, her expression slightly ugly. Ever since the palace master of Consonance Palace had left for a long time, Grandma Shichuan had begun to think of ways to nurture her disciples. As for LV Qinghan and Zither Fairy, they were the palace master's subordinates. As the major factions worked together to deal with the Sword Sect's Tower Forest, the situation became extremely chaotic. Zither Fairy, Chen Yi, and the others wanted to help the Sword Sect's Tower Forest, but they were stopped by Zhou Tong, Ren Tingting, and the others. Right now, the Sword Sect's Tower Forest was in an extremely bad situation. Yan Wushuang was facing demonic saber Ling Ju alone, while Bai Zichen, Wang Xiaotian, and Ji Ling were facing off against Nia Ling, Mo Juechen, and the 2 prodigies from the Limitless Sword Sect. In terms of numbers, the Sword Sect's Tower Forest was inferior to the Limitless Sword Sect and the saber-conferred Monarch Palace. In terms of strength, they could not suppress their opponents. Under such pressure, the 5 disciples of the Sword Sect's Tower Forest were surrounded by danger. On the other side, Yuan Mia was surrounded by 3 prodigies from the 3 imperial palaces. He was also in a bad situation. His cultivation was only at the 8th transformation divine soul stage. Even with the help of the dark sword intent, he could only fight against a prodigy at the 9th transformation divine soul stage. On the other hand, Princess Yuan Shi and Mo Langya were both prodigies at the 9th transformation divine soul stage. Although Fang Chen was slightly weaker, he was also at the 7th transformation divine soul stage. Yuan Mia, I'll give you a choice now. Leave the Sword Sect's Tower Forest and join the Saint Origin Academy. That way, you won't be severely injured, Princess Yuan Shi said arrogantly. In your dreams. Yuan Mia's single eye was cold and deadly. He held his sword and attacked. The sword light was as silent as the night. Bastard, you overestimate yourself. Princess Yuan Shi did not hold back anymore. Mo Langya and Fang Chen also attacked with all their strength. No matter how strong Yuan Mia was, he could not fight against the 3 of them. He kept coughing up blood and retreating. Seeing this, the people of the Sword Sect's Tower Forest were furious. Such a shameless siege was actually happening right in front of his eyes. However, in the eyes of the limitless Sword Sect and other forces, this scene was not tragic. Xian Hao looked indifferently at the people of the Sword Sect's Tower Forest and said, Xian Feng, Xian Dai, and Murong Ditian, you guys attack. Murong Ditian nodded slightly. His strength had also reached the 7th transformation divine soul stage. Although Xian Feng and Xian Dai were not happy with Xian Hao, Xian Tai had indeed appointed Xian Hao as the leader. They could not fight with Xian Hao under Xian Tai's nose. You're the one who occupied the first platform, but we have to do the hard work, Xian Dai said sarcastically. Sister Dai, forget it. Palace Master Xian will see our strength, Xian Feng said. They directly attacked Yan Wushuang and the others. Even the limitless Sword Sect's black and white impermanents are attacking. Xian Feng and Xian Dai's attacks caused an uproar again. It was rumored that the 2 of them were telepathic. When they attacked together, their strength was even comparable to Xian Hao and other top prodigies. Their participation immediately caused the Sword Sect's Tower Forest, which was already in danger, to fall into even more danger. Murong Ditian attacked with the Mara sword in his hand. Ji Ling could not block it in time and vomited blood. Wang Xiaotian and Bai Zichen were also forced into a desperate situation. Bai Zichen suddenly unleashed his strength, which was actually close to Yan Wushuang's. However, he was suppressed by the other enemies in the blink of an eye. Damn it! Blood flowed from the corner of Bai Zichen's mouth. His expression was very ugly. To think that he had held back some of his strength. He wanted to unleash it at the crucial moment to turn the tide. However, even if he unleashed his strength now, it was useless. He was directly suppressed. We're finished this time, Wang Xiaotian's face was ashen. However, the most fatal one was Yan Wushuang. Leng Ju had already caused Yan Wushuang to not dare to be careless. Following the black and white impermanence's attacks, Yan Wushuang almost instantly fell into an extremely passive situation. She continuously retreated. Although she had the protection of the ice silk skirt, her injuries were becoming more and more serious. It could be said that the participating Sword Sect's Tower Forest disciples had all fallen into a hopeless situation. At the same time that the Sword Sect's Tower Forest disciples were in danger, Yi Guqin in the inn's forging room had finally completed the fusion and repair of the snow clay embryo. Chapter 4:15. In the forging room, Yi Guqin looked at the 2 divine weapons in front of him. The large piece of snow clay fetus had been used up and merged into the blood prison sword and the heavenly demon general armor. Of course, the snow clay fetus alone was not enough to completely repair these 2 supreme-grade divine weapons. Even so, the power of these 2 divine weapons was far greater than before. Most of the cracks on the surface of the weapons had also healed. The snow clay fetus is indeed useful. Other than the blood spirit formation, the blood prison sword and the heavenly demon general armor can each use another formation, Yiguchen thought. With one spiritual formation, one could be called a divine weapon. However, supreme-grade divine weapons obviously had more than one formation. After being repaired, the blood prison sword could use another formation called the splitting edge formation. The splitting edge formation could increase the sharpness of the blood prison sword. To a certain extent, it was similar to the splitting edge formation on the tribulation dust sword. As for the heavenly demon general armor, it could use a frenzy blood formation. After activating the frenzy blood formation, the heavenly demon general armor could stimulate the blood in Yiguchen's body, allowing Yiguchen to double his combat strength. This double combat strength was not to be underestimated. Yiguchen's current strength was comparable to a top expert in the 9 transformations of the divine soul. After activating it, he would not be much weaker than an expert in the small hidden gate. Of course, although the frenzy blood formation's effect was strong, the amount of blood consumed was also extremely shocking. Even with Yiguchen's current vigorous blood, he could only last for 15 minutes at most. If it lasted for too long, Yiguchen would be in danger of running out of blood. The time taken to repair the divine weapons exceeded my expectations. Yiguchen put the 2 divine weapons into his origin ring. Without delay, Yiguchen got up and left. He held the bamboo hat and thought for a while. He did not wear it and put it back into his origin ring. Since he had chosen to participate in the exchange, Yiguchen did not need to hide anymore. After today, the name of the sword sect would once again appear in the eyes of the world. The sword master, who had once killed hundreds of people with a single sword strike and caused the geniuses of the 7 major forces to tremble in fear, would return once again. Yiguchen walked out with his hands clasped behind his back. The innkeeper at the inn's entrance was a little puzzled. Because Yiguchen had been wearing a bamboo hat when he entered, the shopkeeper didn't recognize him at first. Yiguchen walked in front of the shopkeeper and took out a crystal jade to pay the bill. This guest looks a little familiar. The shopkeeper sized up Yiguchen's face. Ha, is that so? Yiguchen smiled faintly and didn't say anything else. After handing over the crystal jades, he waved his hand and left. Looking at Yiguchen's back as he left, the shopkeeper was deep in thought. Because he did feel that the young man's face was somewhat familiar. At some point, a thought flashed through the shopkeeper's mind. He recalled that a painter had once come here but had no money to pay the bill. In the end, he painted a portrait of the sword sect's Yiguchen as payment. The portrait of the sword sect that the painter had drawn was exactly the same as the youth that had just left. Clatter, the crystal jade in the shopkeeper's hand slipped to the ground. His expression froze, and there was extreme shock in his eyes. I must have seen wrongly. How could it be? The shopkeeper muttered in a daze. In the arena. At this moment, the competition between the prodigies of the 7 forces had reached its climax. Especially the sword sect's Tower of Lin, Yan Wushuang, and the others, who were fighting against the other forces. The surrounding spectators couldn't help but sigh. The sword sect's Tower of Lin had lost this time. Yan Wushuang was surrounded by Lingju, the black and white deities. Her entire body was covered in wounds, and the blood flowing from the corner of her mouth even dyed her chin red. However, Yan Wushuang still held the sword in her hand tightly, unwilling to give up. Sigh, what a pity. Without the sword sect's Tower of Lin, the sword sect's Tower of Lin is actually so weak. Xian Dai's words were filled with sarcasm. Shut up. Yan Wushuang's eyes were extremely cold as she gritted her teeth. She wasn't willing to admit that even without Yiguchen, she still wanted to win first place. On the other side, Bai Zichen and the others were also badly suppressed. As for Yuan Mia, he was surrounded by Queen Yuan Shi and the other 2. He was in an even worse state, and his black robe was soaked in blood. Even Zither Fairy, who wanted to help, was injured by Ren Tingting, and there was blood at the corner of her mouth. Although she had the ancient zither, her cultivation wasn't particularly high. Naturally, she couldn't compare to Ren Tingting, who had a divine soul 9 transformations. Ha, Zither Fairy, don't think about getting what you don't deserve. Ren Tingting's face was cold as she attacked mercilessly. Zither Fairy was being pursued by Zhou Tong, and it made her burn with jealousy. I don't have a special relationship with young Master Zhou. Zither Fairy wiped the blood at the corner of her mouth. What kind of person is young Master Zhou? How can he be seduced by an ordinary woman? It must be you, a vixen, who used some means to attract young Master Zhou's attention and deliberately pretended to be cold and aloof. Ren Tingting's brain circuit was clear, and she thought that Zither Fairy was playing hard to get. You. Zither Fairy bit her lips until they bled after being insulted by Ren Tingting. I'll teach you a lesson today. Stay away from young Master Zhou in the future. Ren Tingting's attack was ruthless, causing Zither Fairy to be heavily injured. Although LV Qinghan wanted to help, she was stopped and couldn't. It could be said that up until now, whether it was Yan Wushuang's group or Zither Fairy's group who wanted to help, the situation was very bad. It was very miserable. Sigh. The Sword Sect Pagoda Forest was gloomy. Chu Qingqi, Yi Xia, and the others also sighed. Only Feng Manlu had a calm expression and only maintained his silence. At this moment, the situation in the arena changed again. That Bai Zichen actually directly left the pyramid and flew toward the outer perimeter. This sudden scene caused all the spectators around the fighting arena to reveal expressions of surprise. Could it be that someone from the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest was going to leave? This was something that had never happened in the past social gatherings. Bai Zichen, what are you doing? Yan Wushuang, who was fighting a bloody battle, shouted angrily. She was incomparably furious. Bai Zichen's expression was uncertain, but he didn't reply. At this moment, he was already injured. If he continued, he would definitely be heavily injured. Knowing that it was already impossible to obtain first place, even if he continued, it would be futile. Therefore, Bai Zichen decided to withdraw. Wang Xiaotian, why aren't you leaving? Bai Zichen actually turned around and shouted. He wasn't willing to withdraw alone. It would be too conspicuous. He had to pull someone along. Wang Xiaotian was also heavily injured. He slightly clenched his teeth and revealed a hesitant expression. But in the end, he still retreated to the outside like Bai Zichen. This scene caused an uproar in the surroundings. A genius disciple of a major faction had actually withdrawn one after another. This was absolutely an unerasable humiliation. You. Yan Wushuang was so angry that her liver and gallbladder were about to burst. Her delicate face was scarlet red from anger. As for the remaining people, only Ji Ling and Yuan Mia were left. Yuan Mia was already on the verge of despair. Although Ji Ling was a woman, she didn't withdraw and bitterly persisted. Whoosh! A sword suddenly stabbed out from behind Ji Ling. It was Murong Ditian. The Mara sword directly pierced through Ji Ling's shoulder. Nia Ling and Mo Juechen immediately attacked. Swordlight split the sky and fiercely bombarded Ji Ling's body. With a poochie sound, she vomited a large mouthful of blood. Her body was covered in hideous wounds. She fell into a pool of blood with a plop sound like a falling swan. According to the rules of the exchange, no one was allowed to take another's life. Thus, Ji Ling still had a breath left in her, but she was heavily injured and unconscious. Ji Ling! Yan Wushuang cried out in grief. She, who had always been as resolute as a man, had tears welling up in her eyes at this moment. Bastard! The eyes of all the disciples of the Sword Sect's pagoda were blood red, and the veins on their foreheads were bulging. They were cursing those who had surrounded and attacked Ji Ling. They were also cursing Bai Zichen and Wang Xiaotian. The two of them, dignified men, were actually inferior to a woman like Ji Ling. Ji Ling would rather die than retreat. She fell into a pool of blood, while they fled outside the arena. Senior Brother Bai, did we do something wrong? Wang Xiaotian felt the fury of the disciples of the Sword Sex Pagoda and asked nervously. What's wrong? The outcome has already been decided. Could it be that we're still going to endure with heavy injuries? Bai Zichen said as if it was a matter of course. It was also at this moment that Yan Wushuang was momentarily distracted because of Ji Ling. When Ling Ju saw this, he directly took the opportunity to charge forward and break through Yan Wushuang's defense. As for Xian Feng and Xian Dai, their hearts were connected. How could they miss this opportunity? They directly attacked Yan Wushuang with their swords. If this sword strike hit, even Yan Wushuang would be completely injured and unable to fight anymore. However, Ling Ju's previous attack had already caused Yan Wushuang to reveal a flaw. She could not avoid this attack of the black and white impermanence. Is this the end? Yan Wushuang's mouth revealed a trace of bitterness. It turned out that with her strength alone, she was still unable to turn the tide. The disciples of the Sword Sex Pagoda could not bear to see this scene. They all lowered their heads and were dejected. Their Sword Sex Pagoda had never been humiliated and in such a sorry state. However, at this critical moment, the world seemed to have fallen into a deathly silence. A green sword river traversed the sky, vast and mighty, like an azure dragon of the 9 heavens. It was 30,000 heaven-splitter sword souls. They split the heavens and the earth and shook the world. Chapter 4:16. In the arena, Yan Wushuang and the others were on the verge of collapsing. If even Yan Wushuang fell, the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest would have no chance of turning the tables. Yan Wushuang could even see the disdainful sneers on Xian Feng and Xian Dai's faces. This time, the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest had lost miserably. Even a woman as determined as Yan Wushuang felt a crack in her heart. As for Qing He and the other elders, as well as Chu Qingqi and the other inner court disciples, they all looked gloomy. On the other hand, the elders and disciples of the Limitless Sword Sect all had smiles on their faces. It was as if they could already see the tragic end of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest. Xian Tai, Grandma Shichuan, and the others could not help but smile. They believed that the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest's fate was sealed. Who would be able to turn the tide? However, at this critical juncture, a whistling sound came from the distance. This sound was like a dragon's roar that shook the entire arena. What? What's that? Many people noticed the cyan-colored torrent that streaked across the sky. It wasn't an azure dragon, but a torrential tide formed by 30,000 azure sword souls. That's... When the disciples of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest saw this, their expressions froze. Then, a look of ecstasy appeared in their eyes. He had come. The dream and belief of all the inner court disciples of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest had come. Even Elder Qing He and the others could not hide their excitement. Their clenched fists trembled slightly. The corners of Feng Manla's mouth curled up into a smile as if he had been relieved of a heavy burden. He knew that the successor he had chosen would not disappoint him. What's that? At this moment, whether it was the spectators or the sky prides in the arena, they were all shocked by this sudden scene. 30,000 sword souls streaked across the sky. This scene was truly shocking. Someone's in there. Suddenly, a sky pride seemed to have seen something. He pointed at the green torrent of sword souls and could not help but exclaim. A figure with a pair of fiery wings could be seen in the green torrent. Boom! 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 The terrifying 30,000 sword souls charged toward Yan Wushuang to block the attacks of the black and white impermanence, Ling Ju, and the others. Then, a figure with fiery wings on his back flashed forward. He grabbed Yan Wushuang's slender waist and retreated to avoid the true energy ripples caused by the collision. When Yan Wushuang saw who it was, a complicated look appeared in her eyes. At the same time, when she felt her waist being hugged, a faint blush appeared on her usually cold and indifferent face. At the same time, a sense of shame spread in her heart. In the end, was he still the one who could turn the tide? Yan Wushuang's eyes as faces of the swords SSSSSS of the swords Switzes SSS. The S this was this, the S of the being of. When the dust settled, a thin figure in a black robe stood upright like a sword that reached the heavens. He had sharp eyebrows and bright eyes. He was extraordinarily handsome, but his eyes were still. A person who shouldn't have appeared in this place. It was impossible for him to appear here alive. Appeared, the thousands of spectators around the arena, including the 7 major forces, Gongsun family, Shinto family, and the geniuses who were fighting in the arena, stopped their attacks and stared blankly at the young man who had suddenly appeared. Many people couldn't forget that face. Nia Ling, Mo Juechen, Shinto Miao, Fang Chen, and the other geniuses who had escaped from the Void Sword realm looked at Yi Guqin. Their faces froze almost instantly, as if they were frozen. As for Xian Hao, he almost couldn't hold it in. His was a little chaotic. He stared at the young man who had appeared. "What's wrong with you?" Princess Yuan Shi and Mo Lengyue frowned as they looked at Fang Chen, whose face had suddenly turned pale. Yi. Fang Chen's voice trembled slightly. He thought of the Void Sword realm again. The young man had stepped on the Azura Blood Sea and killed hundreds of people with his sword. That destructive lightning tide had directly taken the lives of hundreds of elite disciples. Princess Yuan Shi frowned slightly. She felt that Fang Chen had become stupid. Impossible, this is absolutely impossible. Xian Tai's gaze was fixed on Yi Guqin. Almost everyone who knew Yi Guqin couldn't believe their eyes. On the other side, Chen Yi, Bai Yanji, and the others were also stunned. Immediately, they were overjoyed. As for Zither Fairy, it was as if she had been struck by lightning. Although she was severely injured, she didn't seem to feel it. Her entire mind, her entire vision, was filled with that figure. Lord Yi. Zither Fairy cried tears of joy. Even all the pain in her body seemed to have disappeared. Senior brother Yi. Senior brother Yi Guqin. On the side of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest, all the inner yard disciples roared like crazy. Some even shed tears of excitement. Even people like Chu Qingqi and Yi Xia, who were calm, had tears in their eyes at this moment. Even Qing He and the other elders were so excited that they couldn't control themselves. Gu Tuo's face also showed a complicated expression. When the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest was in a desperate situation, the last person to appear was still that figure. The crazy shouts of the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest disciples were like a torrent, spreading throughout the entire gladiator arena. What? Did I hear wrong? Yi Guqin? Is it that Yi Guqin? How is it possible? Didn't he die in the Void Sword realm? How can he still be alive? Looking at the Sword Sect Pagoda Forest's attitude, that young man is Yi Guqin. It's incredible that he's still alive. The entire gladiator arena was in an uproar like never before. The noise rose to the sky. Is that Yi Guqin from the Sword Sect? He's so handsome. Gongsun Xiaoye exclaimed. However, the faces of the people from the other forces were not looking good. Xian Tai, Grandma Shichuan, the Flame Emperor, Hun Tianho, and the others all had gloomy expressions. Although they didn't know how Yi Guqin had survived, what they saw was what they saw. However, seeing was believing. Yi Guqin had appeared in front of them alive. This was an irrefutable fact. Can anyone tell me why he's still alive? Grandma Shichuan's old face was cold. He's really tough. Xian Tai sighed. Ha, it's good that he's still alive. It's time to avenge my disciple. The Flame Emperor's eyes were incomparably cold. Clearly, Yi Guqin's arrival had made some people excited. However, most of them were looking at him with hatred. After all, Yi Guqin's actions in the Void Sword realm had offended too many people. Yi Guqin let go of Yan Wushuang's waist and swept his gaze across the gladiator arena. Ji Ling was lying in a pool of blood. His Yuan Mia was severely injured and on the verge of death. Yan Wushuang's eyes were red. She gritted her teeth and said, "The Limitless Sword Sect and the other forces are shameless." They joined forces to deal with the Sword Sect's pagoda forest. Yan Wushuang's voice was choked with sobs. Meanwhile, at the Sword Sect's forest of pagodas, an inner court disciple was unable to restrain the grief and indignation in his heart any longer, and he actually knelt on one knee with a bang before cupping his fists towards Yi Guqin and shouting in a clear voice. "Senior brother Yi, please draw the sword for our Sword Sect's pagoda forest." Shortly after, another inner court disciple knelt on one knee with red eyes. "Senior brother Yi, please draw the sword for our Sword Sect's pagoda forest." Like a chain reaction, all of the inner court disciples, including Chu Qingqi, Yi Xia, and the others, dropped to one knee in unison and exclaimed loudly, "Let's go." Elder Qing he sighed softly and cupped his fists at Yi Guqin as well. "Yi Guqin, please draw the sword for our Sword Sect's pagoda forest." Subsequently, Shi Yun and the other elders, including Gu Tuo, who had a grudge against Yi Guqin, sighed and cupped their fists with a complicated expression. However, the most shocking thing was that Feng Manlu, who had his hands behind his back, also cupped his fists towards Yi Guqin. "Yi Guqin, please draw the sword for our Sword Sect's pagoda forest." Boom! All the inner court disciples from the Sword Sect's pagoda forest, including Feng Manlu, shouted in unison. Their voices pierced through the clouds and shook the heavens and earth. "Please draw the sword for our Sword Sect's pagoda forest." You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.